Prologue. While traveling the world, I've seen the true power of corruption, and I don't know what's worse: living in exile in the wilderness, fighting daily for survival against creatures from the Vale, hordes of roaming giants, and other monstrosities, or being corralled into technical pens with all those other clueless souls, their minds rotting away in a virtual world as they work themselves to death and their bodies wither. As an ambassador for the Holy City, I had the privilege to travel and spread our views. My head ached and my vision blurred as I watched the people of the large western cities walking around like zombies, blind to their surroundings, or sitting in virtual cafes, unwilling to leave their dystopian fantasy world of numbers. I saw quiet, poisonous greed spreading through the coastal megacities, and politicians woefully exploiting the people who elected them. My research led me to evidence that these cities were built as prisons for humanity. I found a legend about 6 beings of incredible power who fought alongside a race of sentient dragons to bring an end to humanity and its wars. These dragons evolved from a technological mishap, but as nature took its course they came to be known as the emperors of our world. The 6 who fought alongside them were the first dragonkin, survivors, or products, of the last great war, the one that led to the end of the world. With their knowledge, the 6 forced much of humanity into the big tech cities and trapped them there. And before the 6 disappeared, they destroyed all the formal governments and replaced them with the Pantheon, who are worshipped as gods and hold sole authority over the fate of humans on our continent. Dragons became the dominant race in the world. They in turn created a race of human, dragon hybrids based on the 6. These beings embodied the greed and thirst for power of their fire-breathing masters. But the dragons were divided by color, each type with its own needs and wants, and it was this lack of unity that led to the fall of the mighty dragon race. The red dragons, warlike in nature, craved battle and riches. The blue dragons preferred to live in harmony with the world's other creatures as they ruled over the balance. The green dragons wandered the globe, creating elaborate tunnels and cities beneath the earth, where they lived hermetic lives apart from all the other races. And the gold dragons stood atop them all, their command over their race's innate abilities giving them access to tremendous energy and power. The golden dragons were able to subdue the others of their race, and they ruled over all dragons without challenge. But their thirst for power and knowledge led them to discover the Veil. The darkness of the Veil gave greater power to all dragons, but eventually, inevitably, they began falling to its addictive, corrupting energy. As the blight seeped through their bodies, the creatures lost their unique colors and came to be shrouded in shadowy black scales. Finally, a civil war broke out, and while the mighty creatures' attention was diverted, humankind seized the opportunity to retake their freedom. The infighting allowed humans to use their innate ingenuity and technological prowess to lay waste to the Dragonkin's armor and reduce their overlords' numbers, and their powerful race of slave soldiers were absorbed into humanity's own armies. Finally, they hunted down and killed wounded and exhausted dragons, until over time the remaining dragons were driven into hiding. News from across the sea said that the western continent was unaffected by the Pantheon's rule but fell victim to breaches from the Veil and dragon attacks. Most of that information came from those hardened sailors and traders who braved the monster-infested seas for a living. They told me stories of giant sharks and squids attacking and even sinking steel ships, and of a colossal serpent that rules the oceans, though I have found no confirming evidence of such a creature. The police forces in the megacities are overwhelmed by gangs and unequipped to stop crime, and they too have gradually fallen to their own corruption. I am now seeing this same corruption growing within the Holy City. When I returned from my travels, I found bloodied walls and a city plagued with murders. I shared my experiences with the then Pope and Knight Commander, but I could already see the effects of greed and power saturating the great halls of my beloved cathedrals. Even our once bright and shining leader with his bright blue eyes had begun to dim and glaze over, and he ordered the massacre of a new human race who were living to themselves in the great lands to the northeast and the west. The war started because the demons refused to pay homage to the Holy Father, but it spread like a plague, consuming the beautiful farmlands and countryside. Many young men died needlessly as the demons used their native connection to the Veil to bring forth terrible magics. Greed turned to fear, and feeding on the chaos, fear transformed into a thirst for power. Our holy city had lost its way. But in a moment of clarity amidst a fight for life and death, one man fighting for the soul of our great empire chose to cut the corruption off at the head. A young paladin apprenticing under the Pope and Knight Commander saw the atrocities of this crusade and turned his blade on his mentors. So, he brought an end to an unjust holy war waged against a people who might otherwise have been our friends, allies, and neighbors. Yet I fear that the rift that was formed will never be mended. As for the young knight himself, he paid the price for being a hero. His great power was sealed, and he was exiled to the priesthood. The Daemon people left the French countryside and headed northeast, settling in an area far from the Church's reach. I share my knowledge in the Holy Academy so that our future leaders can learn from the mistakes of the past, and so that this paladin's sacrifice will not have to happen again. Record of known history. Regis Cromround, chronologer for the Pope. Light reflected off the golden floors, illuminating the white halls of the main cathedral. Moving with a growing sense of urgency, Cardinal Aubrey worked his way to the temple gates. Emerging into the pitch darkness outside, he used the few pale, lit areas of the grounds to slip out of the compound. Then, full of fear but driven by duty and his young leader's mission, he headed into the bowels of the holy city. There the darkness was replaced by artificial light, as neon signs blinked welcome and brothel doors swung open and shut busily. In covering his head with his ornate crimson hood, he did little or nothing to hide his presence. On reaching the railway platform, the cardinal waited for a train to the city gates. He stood by himself, letting his eyes scan the area, and was startled by the loud ringing that preceded an announcement through the speakerphones. "The train to the southern gate is now arriving," a tired feminine voice declared. Weary city folk lined up in masses, impatient for their ride to the edge of the great city. With tremendous speed, the cold mechanical snake pulled to a stop, the screech of its brakes rattling the waiting area. The door opened and released a wave of sweaty, humid air pressure. A vigorous exchange of colliding bodies followed as the people on the platform rushed on board without allowing the arriving riders to exit. Sidling through the chaos, the cardinal found his way to a seat near the back of a car. He crossed his legs, showing the black pants under his robe, and tilted his head just low enough to conceal his eyes while he searched for threats. His arms lit up with goosebumps as he remembered with unease the voice he had heard in the cardinal chambers of the debate hall in the temple. "Allow your fear to consume you, and I will grant you power. Give yourself to my darkness, and I will embrace you with my shadows. Give me the blood of the untainted, and your desires will be fulfilled." The soft, haunting words played over and over within his mind as Aubrey waited for the train to come to a stop and mulled over the arrangements he had made for his agents as they approached the trade city of Paul Vale. Thinking ahead, and not trusting the contact waiting for him, he had sent letters to prominent clans that he knew would act in self-interest. Sweat leaked from his palms as another bout of worry overcame him. Was he sending his men to their deaths for nothing? Sitting alone, trapped by ceremonial traditions and caked in makeup, a young woman waited for the rest of her life to be decided for her. As her mother dictated the path she would take, all she saw was imprisonment. Beautiful and stoic, a sacrifice to better her family, she struggled to control her emotions, unable to accept her fate. Sharp and bitter saliva coated her tongue. Finally, full of adrenaline, Lilith stood, found an exit, and stormed out of her ancestral home. Her mother's sharp but caring eyes followed the stubborn child. Lilith was the spitting image of her own youth, but now her eyes were beginning to show her age and experience. Flushed with anger and torn between her daughter's feelings and her own position as head of the clan, she stood proudly before the elders, weighing the options before her. Candles were mounted on each of the large beams that acted as pillars for the dark hall, and tiny flames danced feverishly atop them, their light flickering off the brick walls. "Get your daughter in check or we will do it for you, Evelyn." The threat burned her ears, prompting her to turn her head pointedly toward their source. She responded sharply to the tiny, sweaty, overfed man who she knew pined for her daughter's rights. "The deal is off. It seems I was hasty in arranging a marriage. My daughter is impulsive, but she has a point." Turning abruptly to face the hall's exit, she let her flowing black hair smack the little red-haired elder in the face. Outside the hall, Evelyn tried to focus her eyes through the muddled sunlight. On catching sight of her daughter's white and gold dress, she pushed off lightly on her tired feet. Sitting by herself with her palm facing upwards, Lilith focused on gathering energy into her hand. As her breathing calmed, the air about the hall grew heavier, making it hard for those around her to breathe. "Lilith, stop! Please stop!" Evelyn yelled as the air tried to drown out her voice. Screaming out with internal energy, she broke through the thick wall of pressure. Hearing her mother's straining voice, Lilith closed her palm, dissipating the mass of shadowed energy in her hand, and turned to see her mother by her side, a tear running from one eye. She spoke with fear in her voice. "I want freedom, Mother. I want the freedom to make my own choices." Evelyn looked at her headstrong daughter. "Lilith, if you ever listen to anything I say, remember this. There is a price for everything, even the freedom to live your life unbound. You must have the strength to take the reins of your fate and live with the consequences of your actions." The two sat, each allowing the other to assess the future ahead of them. "Hurry up, you three." The gruff voice of the expedition leader echoed among the frost-coated walls of the underground facility. "Lower your voice, sir, please. We can hear movement above." The malnourished guide could barely contain his emotions, and his body began to shake at the thought of the feral creatures roaming the land over the installation. This way," the man stuttered. The other four followed closely, watching for signs of their location. Time dragged on as they descended further underground in search of leftover technology. Theodrix was tireless in his hunt for anything that would help him protect the city he founded to house his bloodline. An aftershock rumbled through the laboratory and former military base, setting off some old alarms. Hostile, agitating sounds filled the air, putting the group on guard, and penetrated the thin layer of earth above as they escalated, stirring the creatures up there. The mutated monstrosities stomped on the ground in an attempt to drown out the piercing sound. "Is there any way to turn that off?" The guide shook his head in confusion. "No choice, then. We need to hurry before those beasts trample through the ground." Following Theodrix, the group dashed through the slick halls searching for clues to direct them to the storage area. The largest member of the expedition stopped abruptly, pivoting his feet and shifting his weight to halt his momentum. Heimeier's half-giant body gave him many advantages that he had learned to use as weapons. Now his blue eyes reflected off frost-covered glass. "Old man Theodrix, I think I've found something." Moving purposefully forward, Theodrix drew his silvered white hair back behind his shoulders. His crimson eyes lit up with emotion as he pushed his large companion out of the way. "Is there a way in? Where is it?" His calloused hands traced the door's surface for a way to unlock it. After a moment, the automated alert system died down and the door slid open. Theodrix entered the room beyond, followed by the others. There they found 6 empty pods. A 7th, still intact, sat humming next to them. As he approached, shadows in the tank resolved into the figure of a man floating in liquid. The subject's tanned, almost peanut buttery complexion drew his curiosity. What was this man doing here? Why was this the only tank left? Theodrix scanned the surfaces for identifying tags or marks. Then, looking to his right, he found a console still running. The dim screen read GOD, Global Oppression Directive. Taken aback by these words, he stood speechlessly as his team attempted to access the console. Chapter 1: Prayer and Blood. On the outskirts of the grand metropolis, a humble, neglected church sat by itself at the edge of the darkness. This church marked the border between those who worshipped the light and those who were forced to live within the holy city's shadows. Cardinal Aubrey knelt there, still in his red and gold leather, his usually well-kept brown hair saturated with sweat, gripping a silver-plated oak cross on a gold chain. Splinters drew blood from his clammy, blistered hands, and it splashed on the stone steps leading up to the idol of his god. Looking up into the moonlight, his brown eyes seemed to have lightened in color. The man was praying for his sins and the sins of those he had ordered to their deaths. He prayed not for forgiveness but for forbearance against divine punishment. He lowered his head as he recited the Father's prayer. Pater noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in caelo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimit nobis debita nostra, Sicet et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem sed libera nos a malo. Amen. I have always liked churches. Thin lips upturned, a young man with smooth features gazed into the room. A shame, really, that those who spread such lovely stories are usually the most hypocritical. He looked to be just out of his teens, well-groomed and smelling of the overgrowth that surrounded the building. Grunting as he wiped his brow and pushed himself to his feet, Aubrey raised his head from his wet palms and gazed back towards the voice. He squinted, straining his vision in the shadow-infested hall. How did you get past my guards? You should invest in better training for the Templars of your church. They are not nearly adequate to handling this rapidly changing environment. The second man said derisively. You never know what creatures lurk in the shadows. Aubrey made a quick hand gesture, tracing an invisible cross on his chest. Then, turning fully to face the darkness, the young cardinal summoned a bright light into his right hand. He turned his palm toward his face and began praying. Veni, Sanct Spiritus, et emit solitus lucis tu irradium. Veni, Pater Pauperum, Veni, Datum Unirum, Veni, Lumen Cordium. Consolator optimi, dulcitas animi, dulce refrigerium. In labor requis, in est temporis, in fleetus solatium. O lux beatissima, repel cordis intimaturum fidelium. Sign tuo numini, nihil est in homini, nihil est in axiom. Lava quod est sordidum, riga quod est aridum, sana quod est saucium. Flect quod est rigidum, fove quod est frigidum, reg quod est devium. De tuis fidelibus, in te confidentibus, sacrum septenarium. De virtutis meritum, de salutis exitum, de peren gaudium. Amen. Alleluia. A furious glow of yellow and white energy consumed his hand. The cardinal focused the energy, compressing it into an orb, and thrust his palm toward the interloper. The fiery ball erupted forward, and intense heat and blinding light danced across the small, dirty hall, lighting it up like a miniature star. The beacon filled the church and spread through the broken roof. Nice trick, the man said. You churchy types sure know how to put on a show. He showed sharpened canine teeth. You realize that your light show does nothing to me, right? The figure extinguished the light and heat with a gesture. Red pupils glowed in the darkness. Vampires may not exist, but those old stories serve a purpose and spread like a disease among the common folk. And they help with the mystique, too. He let a smile take over his face. Whatever I am, I'm not a mythical monster. The shadowy figure ran his tongue over his canines and then stepped forward. I don't have an aversion to light. It was an ordinary man with decent features that appeared in the light. Oh, fire hurts and burns, but as long as I have the stamina and the time, I'll heal like new. The radiance of the moon dimmed his eyes as he stepped out for the shadows of the small church hall. Pushing aside his dark red hair, the man stepped closer. Anyway, you're a rude one. Cardinal Aubrey, you called me here, remember? I will happily go. I saw some decent-looking women in the tavern down the street. I might still be able to find a waitress and bury my face in her chest. He let out a sound of annoyance. If you try to show off again, I might have to give you a taste of real power. Let us play nice. Looking at the man guardedly, the cardinal allowed himself a stern smile. Appearances are everything. Every moment is an opportunity to spread the mysticism of the church. Soon word will circulate through the countryside of a lonely church producing a gale of holy light. The man spread his arms wide mockingly. Stories of a priest praying in a small square in a tiny village just outside the holy city and bringing forth a miracle. He walked toward the cardinal. You don't worry about the other repercussions of your actions, do you? How hard they make my life, or that of my kind. You priests sure have balls. Audrey's smile disappeared as he loosened his sharp tongue from its sheath. You and the rest of the Daemon race enjoy preying on the fears of the people, even if, as you say, you are not monsters but men, created by other men. The haughtiness of his voice filled the hollow church. I know what you are. I know what your kind used to be. You are leftovers. A record of curiosity and scientific failure. Leaning against an old oak bench, the cardinal continued. You and your brethren are weapons. You are tools that were once used to carve a path forward. instruments for the evolution of humankind. Nothing but stepping stones for us. Even if you are stronger and faster, it was our ancestors who made you. You are still nothing but a failed science experiment. I don't fear you or change. Evolution is natural, whether it occurs in the wilderness or a test tube. He stood up proudly, puffing out his chest. But enough with the small talk. I have information for you. My colleagues have been spreading fear and mistrust in the villages. The Cardinal's tone turned cold, and he slowed as he gauged how much information he should share here. They are planning something, Leo. But I don't know precisely what's going on within the cathedral walls. Those morons have aligned themselves with dark powers and are corrupting, killing my beloved church. They are turning practitioners away from our traditions. They have built a following of ungodly radicals who terrorize the masses and spread their warped messages. They are undermining all the work my branch of the church is doing. The Cardinal sat down on a bench, looking up toward the altar. I hear rumblings of the Lestrygonians being involved. They are creating distrust. Lestrygonians are just low-level giants. They shouldn't pose a problem for your well-trained army. The daemon said, a war is coming, and it must be stopped. But I'm torn between helping the people and dealing a decisive blow to the enemy. The Firenze is in the path of this surprise attack, and weakening them while also discovering the individuals behind the conspiracy is a tempting path. I asked you here, Leo Curer, because your family at least pretend to be more moderate than the others. You have been known to protect ordinary humans who reside on your lands. Leo looked the shorter man in the eyes. A saint and a sinner, he said. The wind in the building picked up. Willing to sacrifice innocence to find the snakes in your own house. And you call us monsters? His laugh echoed off the hollow walls. Audrey reached into his crimson cloak and pulled out a sealed letter. In here are plans made by high-ranking officials in the church. My colleagues have a pause overtook him as he reached his hand out. This is proof that they made a deal with the Lestrygonians. Nerves made the clergyman's hand tremble. Weak as they are, who the hell deals with those creatures? They might have been human once, but they're grown nasty. Flesh-eaters. They'll cannibalize anything they can get their hands on. Audrey wiped sweat and blood onto his silken robes. They are ambitious, and they are willing to kill for money and influence. In large enough numbers, they can still wipe out a population, especially one that is not prepared. Abruptly he added, can you deal with this? My best priest and operative have been dispatched already, along with 10 of those paladins you're so fond of. Ha! Paladins can sure fight. I know that from experience. And they do not hide what they are doing. They accept their purpose. How can you not respect that? Leo answered. But why would you send priests into this mess? I take it you don't care much for these men. They'll be fine. The most gifted of my underlings is with them, and I trust him to do what's needed. He will protect as many people as he can. The village is called Paul Vale. Leo sat next to the Cardinal and stared up at the ceiling, where a faded painting showed a winged man brandishing a sword of fire and a spear. Paul Vale is growing. Its natural resources are vast enough to compare with your capital's. Probably greater. Whatever you're expecting, getting involved in the holy city's politics will be a costly endeavor. You're going to owe me a favor. Looking to his side over an athletically rounded shoulder, he added. One of these days we're going to have drinks, and you're going to tell me how you lot pull off your miracles and magic without hurting anyone. Smiling at the priest then, he leaped up from the bench. I'll bring this missive to my clan and my father. If the heads agree, we'll depart for Paul Vale with an army. Tonight. Audrey looked sharply at him. I know you're fast, but you're that fast? I am, Leo said, smiling as the shadows wrapped around him like a cloak and he was gone. Alone in the empty church, the young cardinal returned to his prayers, closing his eyes as he fell to his knees. The cold wind assaulted the foundations of the building. Audrey's legs felt weak, and the floor shook as the walls swayed back and forth. He calmed himself, focusing on his thoughts. I hope my missive reached the Firenze lords. The moonlight returned to its place, shining a spotlight on the altar. Audrey's blood spattered across it as darkness overtook him and his head was separated from his neck. The assassin departed with his trophy without ever being seen or heard. The cardinal's body sat silent, bent over, as the remaining sacrament spilled out. A lone raven feather lay atop it, and a cold laugh departed with the wind. Ah ha ha ha! Its frozen sharpness drifting out through the cracked church doors. Tonight's a quiet night. I wonder when the cardinal's going to finish up so we can go home. The cold, laughing wind reached the ears of the Templar guards. At the sound, the two exchanged glances and opened the doors to check on the clergyman under their protection. The first stepped inside and saw the body slumped over just as the sinister laugh faded from the air. "Holy shit!" His voice fired out of the church. "The cardinal's been killed!" The other followed him in. "Let's go. We need to report this to the captain." They emerged, pale-faced and sick to their stomachs, and closed and locked the doors after themselves. "We are so screwed. The captain is going to kill us for allowing this to happen. He's a reasonable man, but we're not going to get out of this one." One Templar remained to stand guard as the other took off for the horses and the garrison. A smog-like film coated the sky, filtering the sunlight and moonlight and hiding the stars. The sun was setting, leaving the fields and forests to the harsh cold of night. The temperature dropped acutely, and solid frosty winds rose and pushed north toward the mountains. Small, abandoned towns lay scattered across the countryside. Travelers and exiles made homes in some of them, creating a network of ghost towns linked up by farms into new districts and city-states. On the outskirts of one of the last major cities toward the border where the eastern city-states began, a clergyman sat reading stories from a great, haggard leather-bound book. Then, closing it, he stood up over a golden flame, its bold light painting ash-covered shadows of the freckled children who surrounded him against the cold brick walls of the house. They encircled Father Alfric Canis like a colorful minstrel, weaving stories of mythical heroes and monsters for them. Dusting off his coal-black cassock, the athletic man towered over the children. Tying his long blonde hair back, the priest glanced over each child with watchful blue-green eyes, smiling at his young flock. Then he stretched his arms and legs and took a moment to observe the small but busy trade village. The quaint buildings rested in a field of golden hops hidden by hundreds of miles of dense forest and overgrowth, and beyond those, broad mountain ranges. The wind carried the dry sweetness of barley, overwhelming his sharp senses. Paul Vale, one of several upstart towns, had become profitable by harvesting the hops and barley for beer. In this rebuilding era, the trade towns acted as factories and distributors of goods to the major cities of the region. Local militias had grown into guilds and then private armies to protect the town's goods and manage the rich trading routes with the eastern city-states and the decaying western metropolises. The economic boom had created local trading empires that grew into merchant states. 850 years ago, Paul Vale had been a tourist hotspot on the borders of an independent union, a booming city of bright lights and art, a hub of decadence and history. 850 years later, only 30 square miles of it stood. The fall of an entire country had left behind marble and steel debris that still littered the once proud landscape. The streets and blood-stained walls of the destroyed cityscapes were laid bare, their dancing shadows burned into the surroundings. The landscape told lingering stories of a civilization lost in the vastness of time. Giant, mutated animals, survivors of radiation storms, prowled the edges of the fields for livestock. Many people of the countryside chose to fight Paul Vale's inhabitants, to take from meeker, hard-working individuals. But the locals rebuilt the city, one brick at a time. Clean cottages, smooth streets of limestone and concrete built by dedicated craftsmen, created a semi-modern quaintness. In just a decade, the city had been repopulated as traders, smiths, and artisans filled the homes. The shattered remains of statues were torn down and turned into the gravel of colorful walkways. Farms sprang up around the outskirts. Tapping into the river west of the town, farmers and smiths cut canals for irrigation. And now the golden husks of corn, barley, and hops shimmered when the filtered sunlight blazed above the fields. Life and a sense of safety and reassurance were returning to the residents of Paul Vale. Stories of the rebuilt town spread as people passed through the region. Tales of a populated trade city forgotten by time and rebuilt by refugees and artisans. The inspirational record traveled word of mouth, eventually reaching the Western Land's new capital, Civitas Levi. Chapter 2. Better lucky than dead. Looking out over the cityscape, the mayor of Paul Vale waited for news about the church convent. Mayor Robstein was a portly, aging man, but his tired brown eyes showed long experience. As he waited, he inspected the gates of his proud city. Soon one of his young messengers approached. The convoy we are waiting for appeared in a small village just outside the forest. That was 2 days ago. Standing miserably at attention, the young messenger handed over a sealed document. We have seen an influx in refugees of late, sir. The older man's wrinkled face smoothed in the evening starlight. Brick and wood cottages formed a circle around the town center, where bustling businesses played host to travelers and opportunists. Lively music played as outsiders and townsfolk alike flocked to the restaurants laughing, and the sounds of conversation carried through the cold, damp night. The streets, masterfully crafted with marble and gravel, gave off a reflective shine as the moonlight and fire lamps illuminated them. Eloquence and refinement were the first things people remarked on when visiting Paul Vale. Prosperous towns, once abundant, were a rare sight in the world now. The church had a vested interest in all cities surviving and growing without influence or interference. With the human population growing again, trades and skills were becoming more valuable in dealings with rising governments of far-off lands, as much as with local provisional magistrates who ruled and squabbled over the West's mineral-rich lands. Civitas Levi, the holy city in the common tongue, was the only surviving megacity in the Western lands. With a population in the millions representing a range of nationalities, it encompassed everything that remained of an ancient religious capital. Its clean marble buildings had stood for centuries. Once a barely surviving relic, it was now thriving and had regained its dominance. As the political powers of the world focused on rebuilding politics and friendships, the largest of 3 major Western human cities held a delicate balance of power, and the cardinals had begun arguing, then fighting, over who would instruct the young, newly crowned pope. Battles for influence and greed turned the inner chambers and halls of the great cathedrals bloody as assassins moved through the darkness. Cardinals began sending expeditions and convoys all over the continent for their personal benefit, to locate other thriving cities, towns, even caravans. Anything that might be leveraged into political capital. The mayor feasted his eyes on the wealth of his town as the people below drank and celebrated another good harvest. They had just finalized new trade deals, and the year's hard work was already being transformed into textiles, new crops, and refined ores, all packaged and shipped to the eastern markets. Lads, the mayor spoke. Come get me as soon as the church representatives arrive. The 3 youths surrounding him carried short blades, rifles, and torches. They all shivered in the cold rain. Yes, sir, said one. Mayor Robstein patted each boy on the shoulder in turn, his wet hands sliding off their coats, and turning the dust and dirt into streaks of mud. After they left, the town's leader headed over to the carnivorous boar. The aroma of freshly seasoned meat pies and roasted root vegetables drifted out of the pub, drawing customers in. The mayor is here, a patron announced loudly. Cheers erupted, sending food and a drink flying off the tables, smashing on the floor. Exhausted, he took a seat and asked for the special, braised duck and gooseberry pie. The mayor's tired legs gave out as he used his arms to take a seat. The cracked oak chair groaned under his weight as he pulled it close to one of the newly crafted tables, a sound the cheers did little to hide. As he waited, a heaviness came over him, sinking into his gut, and a cold sweat broke from his brow. Why do I have such bitterness in my mouth? He muttered. A crack of thunder set the windows to rattling, and raindrops tapped against the glass. Heavy pellets of rain exploded on the sandy roads, quickly saturating them and forming wide, muddy potholes. Within minutes, the path to Paul Vale was a swamp, and the traveling band of clergymen were forced to stop. Trees swayed violently, and leaves danced down through the air. The wind picked up, sending these swirling calamitously toward them. A whiff of iron grew in the air, and nervousness overtook the priests as every animal cried out at once, and the rumble of thunder played an orchestrated symphony with them. Ahead through the woods, a pathway was just visible. Moving into the trees, a grandly armored paladin raised his hammer and charged it, making it lucent. Light ruptured out and radiated in every direction, mirroring off the paladin's armor. Holding the hammer aloft, he waved his companions to follow as he drove himself forward. Thick branches cracked each time the commander raised his hand high, and he balled it into a fist. The party emerged from the dark woods and halted again. Across from the fields from them, the gate to Paul Vale stood anchored shut. The convoy of Templars were accompanied by a small chaperone of priests and a bishop. The bishop carried 2 large books. In his pack was an old, embroidered Bible for prayers. In his hands was a used War College textbook on the history of the Templar Order. Paying little attention to his surroundings, he now held the book as he read. The Templars were established 500 years ago, during the fallout of the nuclear winter and the emergence of the wasteland, by the Council of 12, those deemed the most influential cardinals in the war-torn megacity. The Order's charter was foremost to protect priests and priestesses from harm while serving as explorers and caravan guards for those traveling in the corrupted lands. They have since expanded into the military arm of the Church. Templars led by the Grand Inquisitor and Grand Priest have protected the Holy City and its interests during the burning of the Old World and the current Reformation. The surviving governing bodies use science to alter the DNA of embryos, giving Templars resistance to radiation and the power to wield it as a weapon. Regis Cromround, chronicler to the Pope. As the church envoy arrived at the gate, they noticed a young guardsman overlooking the bulwark. "Stop!" A warning shot followed the shouted command, penetrating the ground before the group. The explosion of gunpowder was audible throughout the town. Dropping his food to his plate, the mayor pushed his seat back and jumped up to rush toward the gate. The few remaining militiamen joined him in investigating the situation. Heavy-footed traffic kicked up the marble gravel as the group hurried to the barrier. "What's happening?" the mayor gasped. He had stopped, bent over, grasping for air. Breadcrumbs and the aroma of gooseberries vented from his mouth. A young man pointed down to the visitors, who stood warily, their hands up. One of the priests stepped forward. His golden hair stood out almost as radiantly as his dark blue eyes. "We were ordered here to assist with incoming trouble." Mayor Robstein looked down from the barricade. "And you are?" The priest looked up, taking in the body language of the pudgy man who asked the question. "I am Father Alfric. We represent Cardinal Audrey, the premier of these lands." The mayor studied the group as he considered Alfric's words. "How do I know you're not ruffians trying to take advantage of us?" "Trust," Alfric said as he pushed himself forward. "Mayor, what should we do?" The nervous young guard turned to the portly man for direction. "Let them in. Put them up in the crumbling church for now, and have the militiamen stand guard over them until I can verify what they say." The gates opened shyly, allowing the travelers to enter the city. "Follow us, please." The militiamen waved the group onward, leading them to a boarded-up building with church propaganda plastered on the oak doors. One of them ripped a few sheets off to reach the doorknob, and the drenched article was taken by the wind and pushed into Alfric's coat. Grabbing the page, he scanned it. Side effects of the alterations led to massive men and women with bolstered bone density and muscle fibers. Enhanced with nanites, humans gained the ability to use their natural electrical energy fields and the radiation in the air. These natural forces could be used to create miracles, also known as magic. Magic in the New World became an unlimited resource, as long as casters avoided overheating their bodies. The natural energies did cause a buildup of heat in the tiny machines, which would stop functioning as conduits and regulators of life if the paladin's internal temperature grew too high. The Order was created and governed by religious science and technology, but the Templars also trained in armed and unarmed combat. The power of magic is still not fully understood. Chants and mantras are used by those gifted enough to manipulation and cast with the primal energies. The beloved nickname, Soldiers of the Light, was given to them by the scattered survivors of the wastelands. The Order gained notoriety for slaughtering rogues and monsters as they cleared old towns, and those who witnessed the Templars fighting off mutated wild animals and the Dark Ones began to rely on their might and generosity. Their dedication to their faith and their absolute trust in the Church leads Templars to follow orders fanatically. In the Lost World, these men would have been considered radicals or zealots. Now, though, they are the protectors, guardians, and heroes of the people. Regis Cromround, chronicler for the Pope. Crumpling the page into a ball and tossing it aside, Alfric followed his group into the cold but dry building. Wait here until we say otherwise. Not wanting to cause an unnecessary fight, the priests and paladins found places to sit and rest their travel-worn feet. The moon shifted, gradually leaving the old church in complete darkness, and Alfric started to doze. He opened his eyes as his rest was disturbed by arguments. The church doors were kicked open, and a parade of villagers entered the rundown building. Forcing the militiamen out of the way, townsfolk bombarded the clergyman with kindness and small comforts. The locals, it seems, had heard about the priests and Templars being allowed into the city and had brought them food, towels, and blankets. The commanding Templar leveraged himself upright on his huge hammer. His fitted armor let out visible steam at the joints, giving him an aura of warmth and power. I am Knight Commander Veru. I'm in charge of this group. Reaching up, he opened his helmet's faceplate, showing tired eyes with crow's feet in the corners. But sharing a deep smile, the man accepted the towels and food. Gregory, distribute the towels to the priests. Pulling himself up slowly, Veru's lieutenant worked his way over and collected the towels. Templars, you may remove your faceplates and helmets. The order was met with an exuberant, "Yes, sir." May I ask a question, sir? Veru glanced down at a tiny woman. Allowing gravity to take its course, he dropped to a knee. What is it? Don't you need to dry off as well? I can go get more towels. Veru laid a hand on the woman's head, and warmth spread through her body. My men and I will be fine. Our temperatures rise when we focus our energies. That creates the steam you see seeping from our armor. Our priestly friends over there will appreciate the towels a lot more. Veru raised himself back up. Taking a stance, he glanced over the crowd, nodded, and began helping to distribute the food. Sitting up, Alfric accepted a towel from Gregory. Are you okay, sir? The young knight began inspecting the priest. Alfric's eyes showed a deep sadness. I'm fine, Lieutenant. Just nightmares and bad memories. Gregory nodded empathetically. Dry off, sir, and have some food. We're making a fire to warm the place up a bit. Alfric unbuttoned his cassock and laid it across an empty bench. Then taking the towel, he started patting himself down, taking away some of the dampness. His eyes gravitated back to the volume with its missing pages. Hoping to clear his mind, he sat down, opened the book again, and plunged back into his reading. Standing more than 6 feet 6 on average, Templars were chosen young and then modified for war as they were indoctrinated into the church. Each soldier equipped himself in skin-tight wild boar leather and fitted plate armor, with a full-faced helmet, a thorn crown protecting his head. This design increased mobility while providing maximal protection. The armor represented their faith and bore a symbol of their savior spread across the chest. After that, the armor was custom decorated for the Templars' rank and achievements. Each warrior of light fought with swords and a dagger, as well as their distinctive mechanical hammers and firearms. The giant hammers were conduits for focusing their energies. The nanomachines inside their bodies allowed the Templars to draw in and store external radiation and expel it with force, and as they absorbed radiation, they stored the excess in their hammers. When they unleashed the charged-up power, they could perform offensive and defensive miracles. The symbiotic relationship between man and machine also allowed for amplification of the electromagnetic energy of the body, creating barriers of impenetrable light. As knowledge of science and technology had grown scarce, this machinery gave the Templars a godlike stature in the people's minds. Alfric raised his eyes and closed the book. The rain had stopped, and the windows now showed a clear night. He reached for his jacket, but, still waterlogged and heavy, it slipped through his hands to the floor. He picked it up and squeezed a small waterfall out of the cassock onto the dirty wood. Scanning the room, he found his fellow priests huddled around the bishop to his left. Meanwhile, the Templars were carrying the drums to the church's center. Veru's voice rang out. Clear the benches. Use any dry wood to build a fire. Alfric glanced back at the priests. He could easily read the body language of the bishop. Why did they send a bishop who hadn't spent any time in a conflict zone? Hoping to head off trouble before it started, Alfric grabbed some food and distributed it to the other clergy. Once they were caught up in feeding themselves, he made his way over to the Templars. Knight Commander, he said. What is it, Alfric? Alfric jerked his head toward the bishop. He's losing his nerve. You're going to have to set him straight. Vera let out a tired groan. Always something, Alfric. Things were a lot easier when we were recruits. Nah. You just feel powerless here because you weren't put in charge. Vera cracked a smile. I guess you're right. He walked over to the bishop, and his voice erupted through the church as he berated the high-ranking clergyman. Get yourself together! You're a church official. If this little journey was enough to break you, what's going to happen when things get serious? Alfric turned away from the scene and walked out of the church. Several Templars grabbed their food and followed him. As he stepped past the militia guards, he was ambushed by a swarm of children. Mister, tell us some stories. Yeah, mister. Tell us stories. Alfric smiled and gathering the children into a circle around him. As the Templars stood guard, he spun out his stories of giants, monsters, and dragons. Other children flocked to the priest as their young minds fell under the spell of his words. After a time, Mayor Robstein waddled up to the old church. The entire convoy. They are not enough to secure our city. Still out of breath, the mayor tried to hide his fear, but his eyes betrayed his feelings. Then he saw the priest, Father Alfric Canis. Robstein turned toward the tall, slender priest. They're coming. They're coming. He huffed. I just received this missive from one of the village scouts. Those filthy monsters are coming. I don't know why they're this far south already, but we can't protect the city. Most of our militia is protecting a caravan to the east. The mayor rubbed his hands dry against his pant legs and coughed, trying to clear a dryness in his throat. Not like they would make a difference in this situation. Don't panic, Lord Mayor, Alfric said. Church intelligence knew that Paul Vale was in danger. Cardinal Audrey overheard conversations in the lower sanctum of the Holy City's cathedral. We're here for that reason. But there are so few of you. Only 10 Templars? The rest of you are just priests. Have faith, Lord Mayor. We only need to buy enough time to get the villagers out of harm's way. Alfric focused his gaze on the overwhelmed man. Nervousness had made the mayor's wrinkled skin slick with sweat. I need you to issue evacuation orders to your citizens. Then you can leave the rest to us. What are you going to do? Alfric smiled. I'm going to have a chat with the knight captain. He walked inside through the moldy doors inlaid with silver and gold. The lobby gave off the shivering judicial scent of a courtroom. Dirty but exemplary tapestries hung from the rafters, and the shadows gave them a lifelike look, watching and judging. In the main hall, the broad benches stood empty as the soldiers huddled together in semicircles, scarfing down their rations and the fruit brought by the villagers, choking down stale bread as they laughed to forget why they were eating stale bread in the first place. The moonlight now pouring through the stained glass lit up the hall. Each of the painted windows depicted tall angels, and the colored light that shone through blended with the candles and the barrels of fire. A villager came dashing in, brushing past the dripping priest and interrupting the meal as he hollered. Lestragonians are coming this way! Knight Captain Veru peered up from his bowl of lumpy barley and almond soup, dropping a hunk of stale bread to the floor. How long do we have? A few hours at most. They were seen on the northern edge of the mountains less than 24 hours ago. The panicked villager struggled to catch his breath. We just found out. The commander reached for his helmet and hammer. Shame you had to exchange yours for that book. He smiled at Alfric as he hefted the weapon. I always proclaimed your innocence, you know. His slight smile did little to warm his arms, which shivered as goosebumps ran across his skin. At least someone in the church must like you, if they're still allowing you to serve as a priest. The battle for Paris was a nasty affair, Alfric said, filling a bowl. But I fear internal politics will always win out over what's right. The commander reached across the tempered flame, keeping the room warm, and touched Alfric's shoulder. I was there. And many others remember what you did too. You saved lives, and you ended a war we should never have been fighting. What you did was necessary, even if it meant killing the last knight commander and pope. But it must weigh heavily, and it is commendable how you can live with your decision, maybe. Alfric sighed. His long blonde hair still stuck to his face. The damp black coat he wore tightened around his body as if searching for warmth. I've made several decisions that set me on this path. Killing my mentors was just one of them. The younger knights, still stuffing food into their mouths, slowed or paused as they gawked at the two veterans, faces full of almond porridge, stale bread in hands. Others, sitting to eat, found themselves listening in on the conversation between the two men. Finally, Varus stood. "Enough with the scuttlebutt! Get yourselves in gear! We have incoming!" The Templars drank down the last of their porridge and picked up their gear as they headed for the doors. From the northeast, aftershocks spread through the countryside. The army of giants, hungry and bloodthirsty, spread as far as the horizon. Amber drops of rain, blood-thick, covered the land as the horde tore across the mountainside, ripping apart everything in its path, setting fires, destroying any animals or humans unfortunate enough to cross their track, demolishing villages whole like a monstrous landslide. Only when they reached the northern forest's edge did the Lestrygonians slow, taking their time to gather before emerging from the overgrowth onto the plains of Paul Vale. There the giants ripped trees from the soil, uprooting whole masses of wood. Great hands hefted the splintered trunks and tossed them through the air as long-range ballistics. Trees skipped and crashed across the land and exploded into sweeping fragments, huge splinters that impaled townsfolk without warning. Blood poured from a villager's body as a book fell from his hands. Giants and the War Against the Gods by Regis Cromround. Heavy and leather-bound, the volume thudded to the blood-sodden ground. Its pages fell open, soaking up its late owner's vital fluids, till only a short passage was left readable by the time the body above it went cold. At first tribal and nomadic, over time the giant race split into multiple civilizations. The Lestrygonians put down roots on the fringes of the cold northern regions. Their massive bodies let them adapt to the harsh environments there. Not bright but ruthless, these barbarian hordes approached the city and organized. The half-man, half-beast creatures had long fought with each other as much as with outsiders, since long before the first of their kind settled in the region. But now, united under Hyrien Amer's rule, the giants set their eyes and their unquenchable bloodthirst on the surviving southern areas of the human continent. They crafted weapons of bones scavenged from their own fallen, fused organic materials with metal stitching, knitting armor from the tanned flesh and bones of smaller human animals. The Lestrygonians moved, spreading terror into the western and northern regions. A loud crack was followed by an explosion, and tree shards pierced the book, tearing apart the remaining pages. Varus surveyed the land from the top of the town gate, his eyes watering from the strain as he peered toward the edge of the woodlands. The Lestrygonian horde had set up an artillery line, using the trees as mortar rounds. That was a surprise. The thought of an organized giant army using conventional tactics gave the knight commander goosebumps. Turning his head to right and left, he set his hands on the shoulders of the two young guards. "You two go find your families. Do what you can to protect them and get out of the city." Gratefully, the two teenagers hurried down from the platform to the vacant street. Leaping from the top of the barricade, Vera landed behind them and hastened toward the church to rally his men and send the priests to organize the evacuation. Giant screams came over the town walls. Mayor Rob Stein was expeditiously organizing the militiamen who remained, ordering them up onto the walls with their guns. "Citizens of Paul Vale, we need to buy time for the non-combatants to get out of the city and into the forest. Set a perimeter along the wall. You have permission to fire at will." The soldiers grabbed as much ammunition as they could carry and climbed up as ordered. Branches swayed back and forth, tickling Hyrian's cheeks. Reaching up irritated, the giant ripped a particularly flirtatious one off and threw it aside. Staring through the tree line, he searched the city's defenses for a weakness. Then, glancing both ways, he gave the signal to begin throwing captured villagers against the sturdy barricade. Hyrian's voice carried out his commanders and sub-commanders. "Get the chargers ready!" His men nodded and handed down their orders. The weight of his crown sat heavily on the giant. Others who were hungry for his power, biting at his heels, surrounded him. Ignoring their staring eyes, he continued to gaze across the field, watching the reactions at the northern entrance of Paul Vale. "They look like children operating the gates, my king." A smaller Lestrygonian, of a leader breed, appeared from Hyrian's blind side. "What of their reactions to our tactics?" Hyrian said without shifting his focus. "The children at the gate look ready to shit themselves, but some calmer, armored soldiers are peering over the wall as well." What are your orders, sir? I just sent out the lunatics. Let's see if they can create an opening we can exploit. Be prepared to take advantage of the situation. Your men are free to do as they wish. I want the city, not the people. The athletically built giant left, disappearing again into Hirian's massive shadow. His muscles tensed as he prepared himself for the upcoming siege. At 9 feet, 7 inches, Hirian was an imposing physical specimen. Even among his kind, few had his presence. And his size did little to hamper his raw speed and agility. Ruling with fear and power, Hirian kept a firm grip upon his clan. He showed pleasure in his people's success, which earned him their respect. And his gigantic temper was matched only by his affinity for manipulating the earth. One of only 4 Lestrygonians who could wield the elements, Hirian had proved himself, and won his clan's kingship. His ears caught word of schemes from the 3 that encircled him. My hair is standing on end, Hirian said, looking down at his forearm. It sounds like my enemies are near. He bent down, and, seizing a handful of mud and leaves, rubbed the damp sediment over his arms and chest to create insulation. Then he picked up his oxbone armor, and squeezed one arm and then the other inside, the mud letting his arms slide in easily. When he donned his chest piece, it added to his stature, even seemed alive as the warrior king gripped his bone and steel axe. He checked at the curved blade carefully for cracks, then loosely spun it in the air above him. His shoulder-length hair blew back behind his neck, and the thick scruff on his face gave him a look of maturity even though his young features showed no scars. His eyes showed his determination to lead his people to victory. Setting the axe against his shoulder, he ordered the attack. A thundering, hammering noise resounded, and the barricade shook. Those are bodies. Those monsters are throwing bodies at the wall. The militiaman vomited as he looked down at the mangled corpses of women and children plastered against the walls below. A lone shot was fired toward the forest line. The bullet traveled across the plain and struck a Lestrygonian just as the giant was winding up to toss another figure. The loud cry brought a sense of satisfaction to the shooter. Light fought its way slowly through the smoggy haze, illuminating the battle line for the militiamen. But as they sized up the giant army, fear overtook them. They found the hulking army watching them in turn, gathering information on their responses. They're going to charge? They're going to charge. A voice called down from the wall. Ver gathered his Templars and headed out to reinforce the wall. Gregory, have the men spread out, the sturdy lieutenant answered. Yes, sir. Reginald, get up top with the militia. See if you can figure out a way to slow them down. Reginald's mind was racing, and he calmed himself as he climbed up to the platform and looked over the wall. Below, he saw the mangled corpses. Raising his eyes, he confirmed what they'd heard exiting the church. Knight Commander! His voice carried easily down to Veru. The creatures are using fear tactics and setting up a charge line. Something instinctual made him duck. A human head flew over the wall, skimming the crown of his helmet and activating the nano-armor that all paladins wear, the defensive shield doing little to stop him from being knocked off balance. A panicked voice rang out. They're coming! The colossal line pushed forward and then began moving, gaining momentum as the giants dipped their shoulders lower and leaned into their strides. They covered terrain quickly and crashed into the gates. The barrier fell with ease, throwing Reginald and the militiamen into the path of the marauding Lestrygonians. Screams died as bodies were crushed beneath the heavy feet of the invading force. Monstrous axes cut through the air. Rushing out of the church, Alfric paused to view the situation. Reginald tried to regain his balance as he was stomped and kicked to the side, his lanky body skidding across the road almost to the priest's feet. Leading the rest of the priests out, the bishop advanced holding his Bible and chanting curses at the giants, the priests under him doing the same. Get down, you idiots! Varus screamed. Go help the mayor lead the people out. The bishop ignored the knight commander and continued chanting. A large spear flashed across the battlefield, piercing the bishop, lifting him from his feet before pinning him to a brick building. Screams rang out as nearby townspeople succumbed to fear, and the remaining priests scattered, running out into the fields. One by one, each exploded as cleaving axes cleared the area. Gritting his teeth, Vera gave orders to his paladins. Slow these beasts down. Do not fail the villagers. He gripped his hammer tightly, filling it with his energy, and then slammed it headfirst into the ground. The area around the gate convulsed, shaking the balance of the monstrous creatures before him. Raising the hammer and swinging, he connected, landing a blow just below a giant's knee. Vera paused briefly as the giant crumpled forward before letting the full weight of the hammer's head come crashing down, crushing the giant's skull. Seeing Vera's effort, his men gathered themselves to do the same. Each man copying Vera's tactics, the group seized the momentum, and one by one, the first wave of giants was taken down. Stepping out of the shadows of the tree line, the Lestrygonian's commander showed his face. Seeing his first wave push back, he didn't hesitate to send in the rest of his army, and the horde of mountainous men tore their way into the city. Retreat! If you can't retreat, do what you can to slow them down. His orders drowned out by the ghastly wails of the giant army, Vera prepared himself for the inevitable. He summoned every ounce of energy within himself, drawing as much radiation as he could into his hammer as he braced for a collision. With each passing second, his hammer charged up more. Turning his head, he watched his men giving up their lives to slow the giant's rampage. Then, rotating his whole body, he swung his hammer from his feet, his hips, and his shoulders, unleashing a massive blast of radiation. It exploded forward as the proud leader fell to his knees. Alfric rushed through the town, collecting everyone he could find. From a distance, he saw Vera fall to his knees, but unable to help, he turned back to keep looking for townsfolk to escort out of the city. As he did, a giant axe grazed his forehead. Blood flowed into his right eye. The giant's momentum had carried it deep into the town. Alfric dodged the second blow cleanly, creating enough space to run. Scared townsfolk fled back into their homes, locking doors, trying to ignore the screams from outside. He kept moving until he reached the far gate, where he led his band of survivors into the forest and away from the crumbling city of Paul Vale. Flickering lights struggled to illuminate a southern keep on the outskirts of Firenze lands. The cold brick did little to hold out the moisture. Inside, the dim, tight halls were littered with empty armor and mannequins decked out in antique military gear. The winding walkways all eventually led the main room where Lord Crisian Firenze, a descendant of Theodrix, was sorting through letters and information from his clan's spies. "My lord, we have received a missive from Cardinal Aubry." Looking puzzled, the lord reached a frail hand out. "Give it here." The servant handed the letter over. Using a long fingernail to open the seal, Crisian pored over the parchment through dry, crimson eyes. Then raising his voice, he ordered the servant to call an emergency council of lords. The decision to send troops would take time. The lord began writing orders, hurrying his words, for the Firenze military to mobilize to the northern city of Paul Vale. Folding the letter, he sealed it with wax before handing it to another servant. "Get this to the staff general immediately." Stress wore quickly on the lord's aging body. He rushed out of his office and into the hall, his legs burning as they began to cramp up. Crisian Firenze had always been pale and sickly, and he lacked the physical stamina to move his body for extended periods of time. Without his family's trademark red hair, no one would have guessed he was a Firenze. The trade-off for his lack of physical gifts had been the opportunity to focus on manipulation and magic. Being ignored by the nobility, even his own family, had let him develop an extraordinary ability to read people by truly deciphering their words. At the door to the keep, another servant helped him into an oversized fur coat and into the cold, damp evening air. The lord pushed his tired legs further to propel himself into the carriage. The servant who helped him glanced reluctantly at the vehicle on his right, but knowing how scarce gas was, he held his tongue and shut the door, signaling the driver to take off. The horses raced into the cold night, drawing their lord toward the Firenze capital. A bright, brownish sun roared high and strong above a trampled, dying field, the blood-red sky tinting it to a strange hue. A growing army lay camped out along the riverbank, and in the forest, birds still echoed screams of terror. Crows perched on wilted trees in a circle, mulling over the buffet of flesh spread across the ground. Across the river, a village burned slowly to the ground, great gusts of wind flinging ash from burning corpses and buildings into a storm of ash and fire. The dry air feeding the fire allowed it to spread, and the intensity of the flames grew, further fueling the blazing gusts. The air crackled with laughter as trees split open from the heat. A pack of oversized scavenging dogs made their way down a nearby hill, ripping the flesh from crushed bones. In the burning city center sat a second army, giant, mutated, half-beast soldiers feasting on the villagers' roasted flesh. Loud laughter and the sound of crunching bones were drowned out by the thundering celebration of an overwhelming victory and the filling of stomachs. Terrible screams echoed off the burning buildings as headless women and men were raped and children were dragged in chains to cages to be prepped for cooking. Flayed clergymen pinned to the church walls by giant spears still cried weakly as the last air from their lungs dissipated, their bodies bloodied, their hands still holding their books of faith. Pages that were once read to inspire now flew about the sky, drawn to the heat, sticking to cooking flesh. Alfric moved quietly through the city, gathering what people he could. The weight of his situation wore him down, draining his stamina, making it hard to keep his eyes open and his feet moving. He stopped quietly to scan the area for a path out. The deep cut above his right eye still dripped blood down his face, blurring his vision and coating his cheeks and his lips. Finally, he fled into the darkness of the forest with the few children he'd found. Oaks and great redwood trees, alien to the surrounding lands, were scratched with small marks, guiding the group to a damp, moss-ridden cave. "Ash from my mother's flesh is in my nose," said a sickly, wide-eyed child covered in blood and black soot. "I can hear her screams." The child curled into a ball, rocking and crying. As if a switch had been flipped, all the other exhausted children began doing the same, their young minds taking in a lesson about cruelty, the cost of sacrifice, and the pain of survival. "What's your name?" a boy asked the young, battle-hardened priest as he reached out to comfort him. Other children gravitated toward his warm, open arms. "I am your father. Lord, thou be your name." The priest began chanting. Father Alfric Canis had only found 30 survivors as he raced through the city, dodging flames and starved, enraged giants. Of those 30, 10 were children. He stared out from the cave as a plump village woman limped her way over. "You need to rest," she said. "I'll tend to the children." As the adults were finally able to take a breath, the weight of what they just survived began to fall on them. Images flooded their minds, causing each villager to experience extreme fatigue. Adrenaline and fear had been keeping them awake. Loud, long marching and the thunderous noise quaking through the forest had kept the children from shutting their eyes. A few hours after the first of them had reached the cave, complete silence fell as exhaustion finally took over, and everyone drifted off to sleep. Alfric jumped up from his bedroll he'd made of his coat to explosions, and the sour grunt of Lestragonian soldiers hitting the ground. Knight Commander Veru, smothered in blood, limped out of the trees, 3 wounded men following him. The Templars stunk of blood and body fluids. Stepping carefully over the dead giants' corpses, still wielding their hammers, the weary warriors entered the cave. "We survived another mess." Veru dropped ass first to the ground. Another soldier accompanied him to the cold, wet rocks. Gregory Stainer, Veru's first lieutenant, was a survivor of the Parisian War. Only slightly smaller in build than the Knight Commander, he'd fought his way up through the ranks. Gregory was a hard man to read. He showed little emotion in his face, but he showed great care for those who served with him and under him. Now he picked himself up off the ground and reached down to help his commander to his feet. "We barely got out of that one, but your plan worked, father," a third added in a relieved tone. Lord Reginald Aubrey, brother to Cardinal Aubrey, was a tactical man. Generally assigned to logistics and strategy, he had been a last-minute addition to the convo. Reginald, not losing in build to Gregory, was also adept with the hammer he carried. His short brown hair showed a fresh gash. Reginald's previous post had been as the 1st Battalion strategist and advisor. The 3 men stood bloodied, exhausted, and hungry. Alfric gestured into the cave. "You all need rest. Please! There's no point in dying of exhaustion." Alfric's attempt at humor brought dry smiles as the weary priest helped the soldiers out of their armor. The survivors who were still awake reheated the foraged root vegetable soup and coffee. At the break of dawn, sunlight leaked through the cave's cracks, reflecting off the damp rocks and water. Droplets from hanging moss had created a small pool of fresh water and a natural sink. The children, eyes still filled with terror, gathered around the pool, taking turns washing their sorrowful faces. Tepid coffee sat atop the poorly maintained fire as Alfric tended to the wounded in the far reaches of the cave with medicine and prayers. "What are we going to do now, Father?" Looking thoughtful, Alfric smiled. "We are heading to an old Templar outpost. It was abandoned some time back, but there should still be supplies, fresh clothes, and weapons. And tall, sturdy walls." Using his war hammer as a crutch, the knight commander made his way to the priest. "Outpost Michael?" Usually full of vitality, he showed the wear and tear of his battles with the giants. "I thought that place was emptied," Gregory added. "It was. I was stationed there once, and I left something useful for our situation. Something I am not supposed to have anymore." Still weary from the night's events, Alfric and the Templars pushed themselves to lead the survivors to safety. Alfric gathered up the villagers and readied them for travel. The loud moans of Lestrygonians resonated off the trees, driving a stake of fear through the children and freezing them in place. The tired priest focused on the moment and bent down to speak to them. "You cannot let your fear swallow you. You must search within yourselves and find the strength to push on, to move forward. You are the last of your families. Your survival means everything." Alfric did his best to motivate the children, but the fear had them in its clutches. It was an okay speech for a priest. Commander Vera said with a smile. "Let me teach you a thing or two about charisma." He stood up straight, and his presence seemed to grow. The commander breathed in and gave out a loud huff of air, gaining the children's attention. Then he turned his back and strode toward the cave entrance. Sensing his confidence, the surviving adults gathered themselves behind the commander. The children, their knees shaking, forced themselves to their feet. "This is how you break fear." Your words were fine, but they must sense the confidence behind them. These people need hope. They need a purpose if they are going to survive. Alfric stood up straighter himself. "It's a good point. Though I'm sure if I had armor that looked like that, they'd react to me too." Vera looked down at Alfric with his giant smile. "Our armor is cool, isn't it? Notice the pearl-white shine. The gold engraving. See how the armor fits our body, how it reacts to our thoughts. The nanomachines that infest the world have become one of a paladin's greatest defenses." He raised a gauntlet hand to show the survivors how the armor worked. The durable metallic armor peeled back on its own, showing the commander's skin, and then grew itself back over his flesh. Then the thin coating of machines covered every inch of his body. Alfric interrupted. "So, your armor is just for fashion then? Just for fashion?" Vera said, loud enough for the whole group to hear. "This is second-generation Aegis armor. Its defenses are powered by our own electromagnetic energy. The more power your body makes, the stronger your shield. We have a symbiotic relationship with our armor. The machines feed off our electric fields, and we reap the benefits. And our hammers are sixth-generation focuses. They store the power we use to create miracles. With training, we can release all that energy in a single blow." "Focuses? I thought the church declared the technology used by the magisters to be sacrilege and illegal?" Moving closer to Alfric, Vera lowered his voice. "You know better than anyone that if something is useful, the higher-ups will find a loophole and convince the masses it was their idea all along. So, the politicians are still spinning their webs of lies to enthrall the people in the holy city?" "Yep." The two men exchanged smirks as they turned to preparing for the long hike ahead. As the group gathered for the short walk across the golden fields outside, the exhausted priest looked them over, doing his best to keep a brave demeanor. Remembering his training, he pushed his fear down, using it to heighten his senses and keep his mind sharp. Vera leaned on his mace, legs still weary from previous days' unending battles. Walking up to join Alfric, the man said, "Let's go!" The dry fields were dyed black from crusted blood and the lack of moonlight. A pungent bouquet of rotting wood and maggot-filled corpses dominated the air. Alfric was skulking about the edge of the forest. Alfric spent the next 4 days navigating the women and children toward Outpost Michael, feeling lucky he had not lost any members of the group. He turned toward the shadowed horizon, where he could just glimpse the silhouette of watchtowers. Vera crept up behind the priest. "I can sense the darkness of this place. The pain and fear have left a strong imprint on the land. Alfric peered out across the distance. There are ferals about, Vera nodded. We cannot stay here. We have to make it to the fort. I agree with you. Alfric spoke. But the ghouls in this area make those goddamn giant cannibals sound like puppies. Either way, I'll have Gregory and Reginald prepare the group to move through the high grass. Can you use miracles? The Knight Commander asked. If it comes to that, I can make do. Vera nodded, then backed up and turned around in search of his subordinates. A ferocious cry crackled through the air, freezing Alfric and his party in place. The wind grew hot and sticky, and the stench of rotting flesh filled their nostrils. Ghouls moved through the woods, scavenging meat without care from the buffet of bodies. Loud howls answered. Giant wolves patrolled the area too, scattering the gray-skinned creatures but heightening the danger. The mutated fiends scurried about on all fours, finally claiming a bare spot 100 feet in front of the fort. They dragged their meals into the grassless area to feast. Cold, beautiful moon-colored eyes peered into the darkness across the field and focused on the group as the largest of the ghouls lowered its head slowly like a hunting beast animal. It sat still, its predatory instincts focused entirely on the travelers. Still canvassing the area, the massive wild fiend hid in the grass. Turning their scaly-skinned heads, the others watched the wolf pack at the edges of the forest. The alpha fiend let out a commanding grunt, and the weaker, malnourished ghouls drew back, waiting for their human prey to walk by. A great, crimson-furred wolf caught a whiff of the group of refugees trying to slip through the tree line. Their fear overwhelmed her senses, and she savored the taste on her tongue. Her giant ears perked up, and she slowly turned her head toward the forest, and stalked back in among the trees. Alfric dashed into the darkness, breathing calmly, scanning the area. Ducking low, the priest stopped abruptly, grabbed a handful of dirt, and threw it ahead of him, disorienting the searching creature. Then he jumped back, dodging to the side mid-flight and falling onto his right shoulder. Steaming hot breath blanketed the area. Seizing a fist-sized stone, Alfric threw it upward into the darkest shadows. A clunking sound came to his ears, and the feral screams of ghouls answered. Sniffing around, the scavenging creature caught the scent of Alfric's blood and leaped. Bulging eyes locked on, and the dry, scaly humanoid came crashing down on top of him. Gregory saw the ghoul leap at Alfric as he grabbed his hammer without thinking. Vera seized the young officer before he could move, pulling his lieutenant down to the ground with incredible strength, and slamming the butt of his hammer into his back. Watch closely. Absorbing the pain in his back, Gregory fixed his eyes on the horizon, searching for signs of Alfric. Finally, his enhanced sight caught a swirl of dirt and dust. Alfric stood at the bottom of a small hollow, fending off the ghoul's attack. Raising his church-issued cross, he slammed it into the creature's claw, causing dark, sticky liquid to spill out. His hand ached from the blow, and the wood and gold of the cross splintered. He stabbed at the ghoul's right ankle with a flourish, wielding the broken cross like a dagger and slicing up its calf to the knee. The monster swiped at Alfric's head, but timing his movements, he dodged and rolled, aiming now for the left leg. He missed his target as the ghoul darted aside. Then it moved closer, its stench overpowering, and kicked Alfric in the chest. Stretching its arms out, the ghoul let out another hellish scream, calling for its brethren to join the fight. Alfric, taking the full force of the blow in his side, was flung back a few feet and slammed up against something solid. He'd lost a good amount of blood, and his consciousness started to fade. He woke abruptly to fire and the shrieks of ghouls running off into the darkness. Vera stood over him, heat radiating from his body, hammer raised in case the fiends decided to renew their attack. Relief washed over him as he caught his breath. Looking up, he saw that it was the side of the fort that had stopped him. The rest of the group hurried across the field and caught up. "Don't worry," Vera said. "The fire won't harm you." Turning to Gregory, he asked, "What did we just see?" Gregory gazed down at the injured priest. "His wounds are healing on their own. Not many know about this ability. It's called the gift of life. Alfric's body is blessed by God. He can summon up the strength he needs to fight his enemies. He has the ability to bring forth incredible power and speed, and that fire he wielded. Those secrets are only taught to elite paladins. He can use the natural magnetic field of his bodies to distort and alter the energy he produces. Gregory frowned. You're speaking about old myths, about the first modified. How can anyone use those abilities? I don't know. It doesn't matter right now. We need to get him inside the fort. Reginald arrived following the last of the group, who were watching Alfric. I don't understand what's going on, but let's get inside and close the doors before our good fortune turns sour again. Sounds of aggression and bloodlust filled the air as the ghouls regrouped, moving recklessly and bumping into each other. The ferals too snapped and clawed at each other as tensions grew in their pack, giving Alfric and his group the time they needed to get inside. Chapter 3. Acquaintances in War. The unkept roads caused the carriage to jump, bouncing violently and shake, causing great discomfort for Chrysian. Playing with his long nails, and then fidgeting with his dark red hair, the middle-aged lord finally allowed his impatience to take over and stuck his head out the window to yell at the driver. Push the horses harder! We need to be in Flumen as soon as possible. As it sped up, the transport knocked the lord back into his plush seat. They continued to bounce over the rocky roads as they raced through the darkness of the forest, and soon raindrops pelted the vehicle's armored top. Each drop of water exploded, giving the sound of gunfire. The driver pushed the horses hard, driving the lord away from his keep. Exhausted, the powerful animals panted for air. Finally, pulling the reins tight in his calloused hands, the driver slowed the carriage at the gates of his lord's ancestral home, coming to a hard stop. The carriage jolted Chrysian from his seat. Using his magic, he braced his fall enough to avoid breaking any of his frail bones. Open the gates! Lord Chrysian demands entry. The guard sitting upon the river city's great walls looked down at the driver. Piss off! No way the frail lord would make the journey here after the head of his clan exiled him to the forest keep. Reaching a long arm out of the window, Chrysian raised his upper body into the guard's view. At the sight of the sharp crimson eyes staring up at them, they abruptly scrambled to open the gate. A loud barrage of words was fired from the top of the wall. Make way! Lord Chrysian is entering! The reins snapped, and the carriage began moving once more. Crowds of pedestrians drew back as it proceeded into the clean and elegant streets of the capital and to the base of the steps that led up to the chambers of the clan's leadership. Pulling to a halt again and jumping down, the driver moved quickly to open the door. As he stepped out of the carriage, Chrysian's legs struggled to hold up his thin torso. Leaning forward, he used the momentum of the little body weight he had to push himself up the stairs, each step a momentous achievement. It took him some time, and the chill of the night pierced his coat and attacked his body. He was out of breath and weary by the time his weak arms reached for the closed doors. He was relieved when they opened for him. Standing before him was a strapping young soldier. Their eyes met as a hand was extended to help him enter the hallway. My lord, the other leaders are expecting you. Chrysian forced himself to stand upright and square his shoulders. I didn't expect you to be here, Krampus. The soldier nodded slightly as he walked with Chrysian to the main chambers. I am where your ancestor wants me to be. Theodrix is here? He nodded again. He is, and he's interested in the letter you received. If the contents are authentic, you have his support. The information in the letter is far too detailed to be a fake. The article was written in a manner to incite the greed of the lords. Why would someone set a trap by antagonizing their target? Krampus asked. I have seen worse tactics. The two entered the hall and stopped. Krampus held the lord up as he was announced to the others in the chamber. Lord Chrysian Ferenza, a direct descendant of Theodrix and spy master of our illustrious clan. Krampus helped Chrysian into an open chair, allowing the lord to rest his body. Let the meeting begin. Boisterous debate began as each lord demanded compensation before sending an army. Chrysian rested his eyes, letting his ears pick up the details of the conversations around him. As Krampus started to move away, Chrysian handed the soldier the missive. Then Krampus disappeared into the darkness of the hall and entered a dim room where Theodrix sat drinking tea with his clan's advisor. Petition the Nosferatu. My clan will provide support. Theodrix took a sip from the cup before him. I don't think that will be necessary. Interrupting the exchange, Krampus walked over to his master and handed him the letter. Opening it up in short order, Theodrix passed his eyes across each word of every line cautiously. Finally he spoke. Ha! This cardinal definitely did his research on the lords. Smiling, he set the letter down. Playing to their greed is smart, and those in the chamber are just blind enough not to see the manipulation. Krampus, I want you to go with Chrysian and make sure the right military leader is in charge. I don't want a yes-man leading this effort. Now where is the child who discovered this letter? Krampus pointed to the door. Lord Chrysian was the one who received it. Running his fingers through his white, red-tipped hair, Theodrix sighed before standing up. Take Chrysian with you and call up the reserves from the military academy. I placed a recruit there who I think will be most helpful in resolving this issue. Or he might make a bigger mess. At the least, it will be interesting to see how it plays out. Frigid winds besieged the encampment, ferrying in the unrelenting aroma of the dead. Firenze's commanding officers flew through the camp, the sharpness of their words a driving force keeping the soldiers in their command focused. The fields surrounding Paul Vale had been converted into a staging area for an attempt to retake the city. In the days after the fall of the town, word spread swiftly and reached the ears of the Firenze aristocracy, who feared an attack on their own homes. The current lord of Firenze clan had issued orders mobilizing his army. On the far side of Paul Vale, outside the southern gates, a great army of local mercenaries and militias mixed with Firenze's formal troops. New recruits from the Firenze Military Academy were assigned to either a militia group or the primary military force. Tensions ran high as the time for battle drew near. Heavy fog blanketed the ground as pale, scaly humanoids scavenged the city's outskirts, looking for flesh to peel off the citizens' corpses. Light tried to push its way through the thick clouds, but its warmth never reached the heat-starved world beneath. Soldier, you shouldn't stare at the greenish-brown sky for too long. The radiation will ruin your eyes. Even if they will regenerate, that still takes time and stamina. Lieutenant Rama's 6'4" figure, square jaw, reddish-brown skin, and black hair made the man stand out. You need to focus on the tasks before you. We are about to go into battle, and who knows what lies ahead of us. I need all my men ready to go at a moment's notice. He checked his armor and equipment as he walked over to the just-minted infantry soldier. Intensity showed in the young leader's dark brown eyes as he crossed the camp. Of undistinguished birth, Rama relied on wit and intuition to survive in the Firenze military's aristocracy. Rayleigh, meanwhile, was still staring up at the sky, as the moon and sun entered into a dance. Darkness crept across the atmosphere as the moon blocked out what little light was available. Torches flared up throughout the camp, and Rayleigh's mind drifted off, ignoring the words of his commanding officer. He felt pulled to look up, as if he were being drawn into an abyss. The comfortable darkness wrapped around the soldier. He was still cleaning his blade distractedly with a ragged cloth, and sudden pain pulled his attention away as he slipped and cut his hand. He stared at the wound. His hand started to heal, but he could not turn away. Fibers of skin stitched themselves together as he watched, confusing the man. A voice drew his attention. "You're a dumbass, you know that, rookie? Give me your hand." A giant of a man in his early 30s approached, sending tremors through the ground with each step. "Goddamn sheep-herding pussy. Why the hell did they give me the fucking greenhorn?" Rama laughed at the officer's rant as he continued to walk away. Tyreen tugged a small bag of salt from a pouch on his belt and dumped its contents onto Rayleigh's hand. Compress the salt against the wound. The burning sensation caused Rayleigh's hand to lock up. "It will cauterize and start the healing." "Start the healing?" Rayleigh wondered. Before he could respond, Tyreen pulled out a bandage and doused it in gooseberry blood wine. His overloaded senses caused Rayleigh to focus on the sweet scent of the damp cloth. "Making me waste my precious wine on something like this," the giant man muttered. "Come here. I'm going to pour the rest onto your fucking hand." The burning sensation of the alcohol hitting the wound washed away the salt, making Rayleigh grunt and grit his teeth. Tyreen started wrapping the wound firmly, and the pulsing ache kept the muscles locked up. Gripping his injured hand, Rayleigh stared down at his wrapped palm, concentrating on the pain and controlling his thoughts. "You are clanless at the moment," Tyreen grunted. "I was put in charge of showing you and the other fresh assholes the ropes." Tyreen was a veteran of the clan wars, rumored to be one of the oldest serving warriors in the Firenze army. Do you know who created this clan that you're about to die for, meat? He chose harsh words meant to torment a fresh recruit. Lord Theodrix Ferenza, lord of these western lands, is one of the oldest humans born from modification experiments. Third generation. His bloodline created the clan we serve. He fought in the big conflicts after the last great war that consumed the world, uniting the modified human weapons in this region into the largest, most experienced army in the world. Tyrene spoke proudly as he remembered his time in his lord's service. He must be charismatic to have gathered so many people. Rayleigh's sarcastic tone caught Tyrene's attention, and he held out a hand to help the younger man to his feet. Rayleigh grabbed the big hand, and with a light pull rose to his feet. Tyrene shifted his weight and smashed his fist into Rayleigh's right eye. He followed it with a quick combination of a left hook to the ribs and a firm kick in the stomach, knocking the wind out of the new recruit. The young soldier fell to his knees. That's for wasting good alcohol and being disrespectful. Tyrene grabbed Rayleigh and forced him to his feet. Rayleigh, struggling to breathe, used an open palm to strike Tyrene's forearm. The pain caused the larger man to drop him, and Rayleigh hastily regained his balance and took a fighting stance to guard against further attacks. A bellowing laugh echoed through the camp. So, you have some fight in you after all. Good. Good, you might just survive this battle. Tyrene yelled over his mountain-like shoulders to his commanding officer. Rama, the new shit-stain got a little fight in him after all. A giant hand landed on Rayleigh's shoulder. Rayleigh stood 6 feet, 5 inches tall, and had long black hair and a toned, muscular frame. He took the approving shoulder pats with a blank stare and looked around the camp. The eyes of all his fellow soldiers were focused on the exchange. He gradually lowered his guard and let the tension dissipate. Tyrene ordered his soldiers to prepare as he walked away, laughing. Entering his tent, Rayleigh grabbed the small chair near his bunk and turned it to face the entrance flap, where he could take in the camp outside. Rayleigh sat by himself and began cleaning and polishing the makeshift armor he'd picked up from a mangled corpse on the way to camp. The nervousness of war had taken over the base, and the constant chatter kept his attention as other soldiers entered makeshift bunkhouses and attended to various duties. Convoys came and went, dropping supplies throughout the evening. An overstressed supply officer silently sorted and stored the army's food rations, checking each box several times against his inventory list. The young officer was fresh out of the academy, doing his best to make a good impression. A carriage came flying wildly into the camp, just missing him as he dodged back. What the hell? Crimson eyes peered out of the carriage. Fear overtook the officer, and for a moment he stood frozen in place, as if his entire being had been erased. As the carriage moved on, he turned slowly back to his job, pretending that nothing happened, and the vehicle came to a stop in the central part of the camp. The doors were flung open, and a portly man leaped down. Move your robust ass out of the way, Hamish. A chiseled man in black climbed down next, pushing the fat man aside. Piercing red eyes showed through his veil. Without a word, he strode toward a tent. Lieutenant Rama reached his tent and entered through the back. Glowing lanterns hung from the wooden supports, and the waterlogged earth hugged his boots snugly. He passed his eyes around the tent suspiciously, scanning for anything out of place. Then he moved to an organized mess on a table in the center, and began checking his maps thoroughly, using a finger to trace the lines and confirm the position of his target's camp. Lysine! He yelled. Where the hell are the papers I received yesterday? A frail man with graying hair and dark circles under his eyes ran into the tent and began rummaging through the chests in a corner. Stopping abruptly, he laughed and raised a sheaf of documents. I found them, my lord! Rama turned around with an annoyed stare. I am no lord, Lysine. You know that. If any actual lord were to hear you address me that way, we both would be flogged and hung from our thumbs for a week. Lysine giggled with a weak smile, annoying Rama. I have no intention of going through that type of humiliation. I would most likely also lose my rank and command. Rama stared at the man with hard eyes. So do us both a favor and shut up and find my papers. The gaunt man handed over the papers he had gathered. Now get out of my tent, Lysine, before your tongue earns us both a lashing. Lysine hurried out, cursing the soldier under his breath. 4 men walked in as soon as he left, surprising the young commander. "You should probably break your servant's jaw, Rama," the masked man said. "You heard that?" "I didn't hear anything damning, but allowing your help to talk so disrespectfully, even under his breath, is not a good sign." Men in blood-red and gold chest plates and half-helmets that showed their fangs stood at the tent's entrance. "You're probably right, Krampus," the young officer fired back. "Well, it doesn't matter to me either way." Krampus's red eyes let him see through the lurking shadows of the tent. "The commander is outside with Lord Crizian Ferenza. We are to secure the tent so they may enter." He waved a hand, sending the other 3 soldiers about the task. The tension in the air increased as Rama returned to readying his battle plans. He could not help but focus on Krampus. "Are the Nosferatu invested in the outcome of this battle, Krampus?" He looked Rama dead in his eyes. "You know I can't answer that. And you also know you shouldn't throw that name around. Focus on your duties and be less suspicious, my friend." Rama sensed the guard's eyes on him. He turned to them, stood up straight, and released his energy. An immense pressure filled the tight space of the tent, and everyone around Rama was pulled down to their knees. As Rama's irritation grew, the force became stronger. Soon each man was dripping in sweat. Their hearts started racing in fear, and they knelt quietly, as if on a guillotine waiting to be executed. Rama closed his fist, cracking each knuckle, taking back command of his tent. "Calm down, my friend. They are only doing their jobs," Krampus said. "I have work to do before we launch this operation." "I don't have time for politics, Krampus." Krampus looked his old friend in the eye. His own red eyes seemed brighter in the candlelight. "Humor them, Rama, and lead your men well. My supporter invested quite a bit in your development. Do not disappoint him." Rama's power dissipated as he refocused on the battle plans before him. "Thank you." Krampus's sincere words reached Rama's ears, and he nodded. A full moon illuminated the night as the raining cloud cover faded. The light gleamed off scattered armor and bone as the soon-to-be battlefield soaked up the last of the blood for nutrients. The once golden fields were infested now with the rotting corpses of villagers, soldiers, and beasts, but the dead zone lay silent except for the carrion birds feasting and nesting in hollowed-out carcasses and other, nastier creatures that scoured the brown, sand-patched fields, splashing through puddles of blood, picking the flesh off bones, and devouring soft tissue organs. Rama had stepped out the back of his tent, looking to clear his head as he waited for the lords to finish their conversation and join him. The frigid air tempered his mind as he surveyed the area surrounding the camp. He caught a glimpse of shadows rippling across the field as servants and soldiers scurried about preparing for the morning's march. Cold dampness overtook Rama, and he gave out a deep sigh. The seasoned officer could not shake an ominous tightening in his stomach. It was as if a cube of ice was sliding down his back. His mind was racing, but he told himself gratefully, "The weather is not too bad tonight. No point in wandering off, it sounds like my guests are almost ready." The young military man had waited hours for this meeting. The group of 3 men made their way into Rama's tent, in the middle of a row of similar ones where servants and helpers ran around in an organized manner performing tasks and chit-chatting. "We need more water." Voices giving orders could be heard throughout the camp. The clanking of metal echoed through the night as blacksmiths filled orders. Slipping through the tent flaps, the cloaked men found themselves greeted by Rama, who showed his displeasure. Tall and gaunt, in a black cloak with red lining and trimming his bony fingers, he looked frail. This was not a man accustomed to the discomforts of war. "I don't want to be visible here," one of the newcomers said. Lord Crizian Ferenza, royal regent to the first family and 15th in the line of succession. Pulling back his embroidered cloak, the lord showed his withered face. He was young for daemonkind, in his early or mid-40s, but his face showed rapid aging and scarring. The effects of using dark magic. "There is a lot to talk about and little time. And if I am seen, I will hold you personally responsible for the outcome." "Relax, cousin," Commander Dino Ferenza said in a calm but firm voice that caused Crizian to glare at him. Lord Hamish Harrow could not hold back his piggish nature and began laying into the lieutenant for his lack of manners and for not preparing a welcome meal. Dino's short brown hair did little to hide the vein bulging from his forehead as he snipped back at the oversized man. This is a battlefield. You would be lucky to find clean water, let alone food. Rama, standing and ready to strike the merchant, finally relaxed his posture. He glanced at Krampus, and his friend's head movements pleaded with him to let the insult go. Hamish, feeling threatened, was letting his emotions run wild. You, Lieutenant, will address me as my lord. My lord? You are a lord out of courtesy. Your schemes and wants are not his concern. Dino smirked at the attitude of the anxious bureaucrat. Hamish, once a merchant, had schemed and killed his way through the political aristocracy, finally claiming a lordship in the Firenze clan. The merchant lord now started to reply, but he bit his tongue, only muttering under his breath. If it weren't for your bloodline, you would be licking my boots. Dino's cold eyes stared through Hamish, driving the porkish man backward a step. Although not a lord by title, he was first cousin to the Firenze bloodline and well regarded by the head family for his vicious handling of a group of menacing kobolds in the area known as the Dogs of War. Rama reached down onto the table, collecting and organizing his plans, and found among them a report from headquarters on just that matter. A territorial group of marauders that took on the features of wolves. Their mutations were able to remake their bodies. Covered in fur-like armor created from their own hair, these wolf-men hunted in packs and attacked caravans and travelers. They were a scourge on the land for several years, earning their name before their bloodlust pushed the Firenze clan into action. Commander Dino led a group of hunters who tracked down several packs within Firenze territory, which earned him fame among the elite. Lt. Green Dalian, Logistics and Information Department. He continued to shuffle his papers around. Finally, Dino looked across the room. Rama, show me your plan for this engagement. How will you break through their numbers? He approached the war board, an old, splintered oak table with 3 carvings of bent women filling water goblets for its legs. As Rama cleared his throat and began to explain his strategy engagement, Hamish sat down in a corner, uninterested in military strategy. He allowed his mind to wander, and his attitude grew heavy as the words passing between the commanding officer and his lieutenant continued as if he were not there. Bored and angry, he started fidgeting and began carving into the sword rack using a tiny knife. I plan to use the band of the wolf as wedge breakers and then follow them up with pincer attacks of 3rd and 5th, sacrificing one band for victory. There are a lot of eyes on this campaign. Do not screw it up, Lord Chrysian interrupted. What are your plans for the Firenze heir? Rama turned to the Lord, pausing before answering to make sure he answered the man in the proper tone. I initially planned on removing him from the field. But I received this sealed letter from the head family. Flipping a parchment open, he showed it to the others and then read aloud. Rama, 3rd Lieutenant of the Firenze Army, you are under no circumstance to remove the 3rd heir Walker Firenze from the front. There is a conspiracy to take his life and disrupt the line of succession. Keep him safe and surrounded by those who would protect him at all costs. I will be bringing evidence of this to the Lord the day after tomorrow. I have sent a courier to you and the Blood Knights with copies of evidence, and a list of the co-conspirators. Signed, Lord Ferdinand Firenze. Why the hell was this not sent through the command office? Commander Dino stood up in displeasure, his muscular neck bulging as he stared down at his cousin and causing Lord Chrysian to take a step back. Keenly rereading the dispatch, he looked up. The courier hasn't arrived yet? Not yet, sir. When it does, I want to be notified of the contents immediately. Dino slammed his fist down on the antique table. Goddamned internal politics. I should kill them all. A well-built man slightly taller than Rama, his straight, expressionless features had helped him come and go unnoticed. As a leader of wardens, he knew the surrounding woods well. He had spent much of his time in them, hunting down the monsters that plagued his clan. For the same reason, Dino was usually left out of the loop when it came to political strife. Do not let anyone else know about this and keep an eye out for people and soldiers who are out of place. Hamish, pretending not to listen, continued to whittle down the top of the weapon rack. Let's go, Hamish. I have some things I want to discuss with you. Hamish's small, cunning eyes turned up from his work. That sounds expensive. I'll follow. A sizable, crooked smile overtook the man. Small and round with stocky limbs, Hamish resembled more a carpenter or a warehouse worker more than a merchant lord. I can't wait to bill you for my hours and expenses. Amazing, Rama said to himself with a bewildered look. I wonder what their deal is. His thoughts turned over in his head, but he shut them off. I can't worry about Hamish right now, though I have a sense he's after something Walker possesses. He stepped away from the war table and called for his servant once more. Lysine, get my armor ready. In the morning, we go to war. A humid darkness blanketed the fires as the loud sounds of metal died out and the light dimmed. The howls and groans of ghouls wreaked havoc on the fresh infantry soldiers, causing many to lose sleep to nerves and nightmares. The loud crunching of bones echoed through the night. Rayleigh's tent sat in the dark. The noises of the night did nothing to disturb him. Lying down in partial armor, he was ready to jump up and fight if the moment came. The frigid winds slowly died out, letting the air warm slightly and leaving behind only the stench of rotting flesh. The scent of rain mixed into the odor, but the foulness was not something one could get used to. Chapter 4. Another endless night. A lone tent stood at the far end of the camp. Flames danced as air filled with the scent of death fueled the torches. An old book lay sprawled open, strong fingers turning the pages at intervals as red pupils absorbed everything on them. A small candle melted patiently downward, pushing loose strands of cloud-colored hair back from his face. The young man rubbed his chiseled jaw as he tried to decipher meaning in the words. The chapter spoke of necromancy, dark energy, and its connection to the veil. Before you can understand necromancy and the dark powers that come from mastering its secrets, you must know the origins of this powerful magic. To wield the darkness as power, you must first create a connection to the veil. The more potent the link, the more energy you can draw and manipulate. Making this connection requires an understanding of what it is. The veil is the opposite of the place where we reside. Everything in our realm exists also within this realm of shadows, and the veil's energy feeds on negativity, on the dark emotions we are taught to keep in check. Most necromancers rely on one of the 7 sins as a catalyst for their powers. Sir, can we come in? Walker slipped the book's tassel into the crease to mark his place. Closing the book, he stood up from his desk. Come in, he said in an annoyed tone. A messenger entered the tent and displayed a missive to the young noble. Walker reached for the paper and thanked the man, who vanished again into the dark night. Turning the letter over in his hands, he marveled at the insignia in the sealed wax. The detail of the eagle held his attention for a moment before he made his way back to his desk to pick up a knife. The crimson seal was easily cut through. He unfolded the letter. Walker Forenza, you're dead. Walker's eyes narrowed with anger. Holding the letter up to the candle, he allowed the flame to devour it. Footsteps sounded outside his tent. Walker closed his eyes and opened up his senses to read the energy of those nearby. Then without a noise, his tent was attacked. Using the veil's absolute power, he dispersed himself into black smoke and moved to a more advantageous spot. Reconstituting himself, he reached his hands out of the smoky shadows and took control of the blood within his attackers' bodies, bringing them down to their knees. Walker's eyes ignited with veiled energy as each man was pulled apart. He allowed their screams to carry throughout the camp, causing the sergeant at arms to rush over to the tent. The soldier in charge of policing the camp turned pale as he saw the dismembered bodies laid out before Walker's feet. Raising their weapons, the soldiers encircled the prince. Raising his own arms in turn, Walker allowed the energy from his body to pour out. He remained calm as he pushed it outward, knocking the soldiers back. Enough, Tyrene said as he entered. Soldiers, stand down, now. Looking towards Walker, Tyrene raised a meaty index finger. Walker, shut it down. Now, Walker's power lessened as he allowed the military police to get to their feet. Explain yourself, Tyrene said, looking around and trying to piece the situation together. I was attacked. Walker shrugged as he looked around at the damage he had done. Where's the proof? One of the soldiers demanded. I burned it. He pointed toward the ash still floating down from the candle on his desk, showing them that he was in control. Tyrene shook his head. Walker, get your stuff. You're moving into my tent with me. Walker looked surprised and scared. I'd like to stay put. I'm fine right here, the young prince said in a tight and fretful tone. A smile appeared on Tyrene's face. Are you defying my orders, brat? He stepped forward, beginning to unleash his energy and causing a disturbance in the camp. The full immensity of his power was a secret known only to Walker and a select few veterans of the clan war. Fine, Walker said. He started pulling his things together. Not one to flaunt his strength, Tyreen regulated his power as Walker fell in line, and he stood watch as the young soldier gathered his books and armor. Hurry it up. The others are gathered already, and I don't want to keep them waiting. They are eager to meet the newest addition to our little group. Walker nodded as he collected the last of his things, allowing the torches to light their path. Walker and Tyreen walked side by side past rows of dark green tents to the regiment's area. When we arrive, sparks erupted from a tent near Tyreen's. A powerful suction drew in the fire from the torches, plunging a part of the camp into darkness. Enormous amounts of heat and energy were being condensed into a single point. Soldiers scrambled away from an oncoming explosion, terror filling their eyes. Panicking voices intensified, and a crowd of onlookers pushed their way up. Tyreen pushed through with his powerful arms, on the verge of rage. "Move out of my way!" The ferocity in his voice caused the idle soldiers to disperse, allowing Tyreen and Walker to reach his tent. Stopping in the darkness, he opened the flaps of the next tent. There he found 2 of his men pinned to the ground by his manipulator. "What's going on here?" Tyreen asked in a less confrontational tone. He raised his hands in front of him. "Lilith, can you release them? Whatever they did, let me deal with it." Lilith looked angrily down at the soldiers. The heat from the fire she had gathered grew, separating the two. "Lewis, Kramer, get over here." The 2 men edged around the space, doing their best to avoid the manipulator. "Lilith, I'm going to take these idiots to my tent and let you calm yourself before you join our group." The intensity in Lilith's eyes faded as the others left the tent, leaving her only with vengeful thoughts. "What the hell did the 2 of you do to get her so riled up?" Lewis looked at Kramer with disgust. Kramer told Lilith about the brothel in the capital. Tyreen let out a deep sigh as Kramer sat down in the corner of the tent with a large grin. "Your indiscretions are your own problem, Lewis. But when your decisions affect my team, you force my hand." He felt around in the darkness for a chair and sat, resting his legs. As his bottom touched the wood, the torches and candles regained their flames, illuminating the nearby tents and bunks and letting the mood relax again. "You're going to find a way to make amends with your girlfriend," Kramer spoke up. "Lilith's not his girlfriend anymore. She dumped him." He couldn't contain himself and slid down to the cold ground laughing, rubbing salt on Lewis's wound. Lewis's embarrassment turned to anger as he focused his attention on Kramer. "None of this would have happened if you didn't open your mouth." Kramer gave him a deadpan look. "None of this would have happened if your DNA wasn't weak, and if you could keep it in your pants." He let out another loud laugh. Walker felt a headache coming on. Tyreen slammed his fist down on the desk. "We are on the verge of a battle with Lestragonians, and you're goofing off. Get yourselves together, now!" Kramer stood up straight, fighting back a smile. Tyreen yelled out for a messenger, and the short man in black entered the tent. "Orders, sir? I need you to run an errand for me. Since I have to babysit." "Yes, sir. I need you to find my remaining members, Yoshi and Berlin." "Do you know them?" "I do, sir." Tyreen looked the man over succinctly and sent him on his way. "You 3 sit here and don't cause any more trouble. Walker, don't kill anyone. Kramer, stop instigating. Lewis, keep your dick in your pants. I'm going to go talk to Lilith and sort this out." He left his tent irritated, took a deep breath, and stepped to the right. As the only female manipulator in the camp, Lilith was allowed to bunk by herself. "Lilith, may I enter?" A breath of time passed. "Yes, sir, you can enter." Tyreen pushed through the flaps at once, catching Lilith in the midst of pulling her coat on and covering the scars on her back. She turned around to face him, nonchalantly tying her sash and closing the fur around her. "You're doing better." Tyreen took a seat. Following the gesture, Lilith sat down in front of her commander with apologetic eyes. "I'm sorry for the display earlier. I allowed my emotions to get the better of me. I will not let it happen again." Tyreen raised his hand in a gesture of acceptance. "It's okay. I understand where the problem is. The fault is with my leadership. I should never have permitted your relationship with Louis. Please accept my forgiveness in this matter. He bowed his head. Boss, we're adults. What we do on our off time is our own business. But allowing it to spill over and cause disruptions in our work is unforgivable. I ask that you allow me to take responsibility for my actions. Lilith sat straight, waiting for Tyrene's response. Fine. You and Louis will henceforth no longer have a personal relationship. You will act according to the Army's guidelines, and you will not use your power on any other soldier, even if they deserve it. Lilith nodded. Now I've sent for Yoshi and Berlin. I want you all to meet our new recruit. But there's still some time before the meeting, so use it to reflect on what happened. Tyrene stood up and placed a monstrous hand on Lilith's shoulder. You and Walker are crucial to our victory. I need you to get your mind straight. He turned his back to her and left the tent. The air rang with the sounds of singing blades along the edges of the camp. The firelight cast flickering painting of two figures. One, giant, raised a mace above its head with a sharp movement, and brought the blunt weapon down with crushing speed. The recipient of the blow was a smaller shadow holding two blades. Dodging the downward swing, the second figure shifted around with each flicker of the light, its movements quickly putting it in position to strike the colossal shadow from behind. A messenger arriving from the central camp announced his presence loudly to the shadows. Sergeants Berlin and Yoshi! Commander Tyrene has issued a summons. The two shadows paused, and a large mace drove into the ground headfirst in front of him. A monstrous man stepped around the fire, a fresh cut running down his face. His kind eyes greeted the messenger with only a hint of annoyance. Sorry, sir, for interrupting your sparring, the messenger said apprehensively. Berlin looked down at the man. Don't sir me, Scout. I am neither a lord nor an officer. The loud ringing of chains sounded from the shadows behind the large man. Sorry about Berlin. He's humble, you know. Do we have time to clean up some before we answer? The messenger looked around the enormous man and met sharp, piercing eyes. I wasn't told whether the summons was urgent. But the commander has already gathered the other leaders of the band. Berlin looked over to his comrade. Yoshi, we shouldn't dawdle. I'm not interested in being punished and forced to work with Kramer. Yoshi's face turned pale. You're right. Let's avoid that particular maniac. Walking together, the two left the edge of the camp looking for a portable shower or water station. His task completed, the messenger wound his way back to Tyrene's tent to report. As he roamed the paths of the camp, he found the men to be in good spirits. Laughter erupted from bunks where soldiers huddled together, watching each other's backs. Blacksmiths casted molten iron bullets for rifles. Mechanical workers moved through the camp in silence, transporting large boxes of ammunition. After some time, the messenger reached his commanding officer's tent. Entering through the flaps, he found the tension continuing to build among the waiting officers of the Band of the Wolf. The putrid air made him sick to his stomach. Changing the bandage on his hand, Rayleigh found that his wound had healed completely. After flexing it experimentally, he set about equipping his armor, methodically checking for any worn parts. Feed me. I'm hungry. Feed me. Rayleigh rose to his feet at the cry and left his tent, bread in hand, scouring the area for the source of the pitched voice. At a sharp peck on his shin, he looked down to find a raven, his blood covering its beak. Why would you attack me, little friend? Rayleigh asked, not expecting a response. The bird caught him by surprise. I'm hungry. Feed me. Jumping back, Rayleigh dropped the bread, and the ravenous creature tore into it, spattering it with blood as it devoured the crust in one sitting. The raven's eyes glowed red, then turned golden. Flapping its wings, it propelled itself aloft and into the tent. It landed on Rayleigh's cot, puffed out its chest, closed its eyes, and fell into a deep slumber. The cold winds picked up once more, sending the temperature in the camp dropping. Rayleigh's new friend remained in repose as the flaps of the tent continued to open and close. Tyrene and 6 others appeared at the entrance. You ready, rookie? One yelled in. Rayleigh emerged with his lower gear on, his olive-skinned chest still bare. He was carrying his blood-stained silver chest piece, a dragon-like figure carved into it. A long blade engraved with ancient runes and topped by a curved handle hung from his back. His semblance is of an experienced fighter. Another of the soldiers remarked. Tyreen gave Rayleigh a once-over. Then his square jaw began to move. Facing forward, Tyreen explained in a stern voice where the recruits were being assigned and what would be their duties in the upcoming battle. Rayleigh stood tall, taking in deep breaths, allowing the putrid battlefield air to reach his lungs. The augmented eyes he'd received during experimentation stared across the battlefield, taking in the landscape. Most of the soldiers of Clan Forenza had similar abilities. By default, they all had eyesight like a hawk's, able to see far and wide in detail, and they learned to see the world with a bird's gaze. By bouncing their energy off buildings and large objects, they could even use something like a bat's sonar to navigate. All demons had heightened senses that let them pick up subtleties in the air around them. Rayleigh knew he was different at the core. He knew it. A potent, hungry rage sat deep within his consciousness, uncontrollable and maddening. Most of the people around him, including Tyreen, were born demons. Nasty name, he thought, but it's who we are now. I am an experiment that outlasted the others. My brothers in arms, my comrades, are long gone. Tyreen gave another stark order. Introduce yourselves. A man even more enormous than Tyreen stepped up first. I'm Berlin George. Rayleigh sensed a hint of evergreen permeating from the behemoth. As a rule, I fight with a two-handed axe, but since we're acting as wedge breakers this time around, I'll be using this. Berlin reached behind him and swung round a giant iron wolf's head mace, the haft carved from the black forest trees of his native lands. The strength it must have taken to wield it bordered on the ridiculous. I'm also rather sturdy. He uncovered a substantial scar above his abdomen, where an axe had broken through his ribs. Then he started laughing. His short hair showed a similar blemish above his forehead. A man of a more normal size stepped up beside Berlin, holding a spear. Two short swords were strapped to his back just above the waist. I am Louis Connor Freed, he said in a strong accent. His hair was slicked back, and his perfume gave off a subtle aroma of the sea. It sounds like we're going to be colleagues. A good-looking man, tall and conscientiously groomed, he still seemed like a child standing next to Tyreen and Berlin. A slightly smaller man of Eastern descent appeared from the shadows. Berlin, enjoying the moment and still laughing, patted the man's shoulder. This little fellow does not like to speak much, he said. But he's a clever little shit and plays tricks with his opponent's mind. Yoshi had his hair tied in the back and was twirling around a couple of chain axes. The weapons appeared to be painfully grafted to his arms. He smiled at Rayleigh and reached out to shake the recruit's hand. At his touch, Rayleigh lost his equilibrium and fell to one knee. This is what I do, Yoshi said with a mischievous grin. Your face suggests you want an explanation. He looked down at Rayleigh. I'm fine with that. You know that inside all of us are tiny replicating machines. Each host possesses a frequency. I can disrupt that frequency, causing a sort of vertigo in anyone around me. My targets. He cut off as Rayleigh regained his balance. How did you do that? No one's ever been able to regain their balance once I have them under my control. Rayleigh looked fixedly at Yoshi before he answered. I don't like being overwhelmed. It pisses me off. I became enraged and allowed my anger to take over, and I focused my rage to break your control over my senses. I guess you could say I'm strong-willed and ornery. It helps me out of a lot of situations. Some friends I traveled with gave me the nickname Surly. Yoshi stepped back, examining Rayleigh carefully, before faintly murmuring, Interesting. He spoke up. I like this one, Tyreen. He could be helpful. He might even survive the day. You shouldn't pick on the rookie, Yoshi. A sweet, soft voice whispered through the air. Tyreen glanced to his left. When did you arrive, Lilith? Lilith's beauty distracted most people from how dangerous she was. Her natural charm was just another weapon that she wielded with ruthless precision. This one is our manipulator. She will be in charge of slowing and corralling our enemies. Rayleigh still wasn't used to his new environment. His mind was clouded, and a feeling of dizziness hit him unexpectedly. Waking up to a constantly changing world was beginning to take its toll. Steadying himself, he stared a hole in the enormous commander's face, puzzled at the title he'd given Lilith. What's a manipulator? He turned to Lilith for answers. She gazed back. Focusing on Rayleigh's brown eyes, Lilith fell into a trance. Arcanum entered her body, causing her immense pain. As the young sorceress regained her senses, she found herself in a dream state. Looking forward through time and space, she saw a warrior's outline. His body was covered in scars, and fire circled and danced around him, clashing with the dark energy of the veil. Focusing on the figure, she found herself overwhelmed by his presence. A being controlling 3 powerful primal energies stood before her. Turning his head to the side, he held out a spear. Its tip, the color of oxidized blood, caught her eye as veil energy burst from it. A crown of gray fire erupted from his forehead into 3 streams. The being looked toward her, blankly, almost as if he was able to pierce the dream state. She did her best to analyze the man's body. His skin seemed to be covered in scales exuding smoke. A reflective shine erupted from him, and the fire began to swirl and push outward from his feet. Recognizing the face as the young soldier she just met, Lilith grew confused and unable to process the vision. Shaking her head, she woke herself from the trance. Lilith continued to look at Rayleigh, making the man nervous. As she regained her composure, she did her best to explain the creation of energies and magic roles. In the old stories, we were called wizards, witches, sorcerers, or sorceresses. Today, anyone who can gather and tame the elements is called a manipulator. Wow! Rayleigh muttered. It sounds like things from the old myths and fantasy I learned as a child have become a part of reality. Lilith was a beautiful woman by all standards. Her long, raven hair did little to hide her piercing green eyes. She laughed softly and smiled at Rayleigh. If you show a talent for the arts, I can show you a thing or two. If you're truly gifted, I can introduce you to my teacher. As she stepped back, her head down, she whispered her thoughts to herself. Maybe, just maybe, this man can help me take my freedom back from my clan. I need to speak to the 3 witches so they can help me decipher this vision. Tyreen let his impatience get the best of him. We don't have time for this, he bellowed. Lilith replied with a glare that could drill a hole through a mountain before letting out a sharp, unfiltered response. Now, Lilith. The captain doesn't want the new guy here to be distracted during the fight. There's no need to worry about the future until we survive the present. A man Rayleigh's own height with cropped hair and a deep smile had spoken. His dark brown eyes seemed friendly enough, but Rayleigh couldn't stop staring at the man. The look in those eyes made him uneasy. The man reached out to put a finger across Lilith's lips, stopping what promised to be an entertaining verbal lashing. His long arms and sinuous movements put Rayleigh's instincts on high alert. The way he spoke, it was as if he was trying to provoke a response. I am Kramer Freud, and like our beautiful butterfly here, I am a manipulator. But the most important thing to remember is that I keep our group alive, more like gamble away our money and supplies, you fucking alcoholic. Lewis barked out. Want some advice, newbie? Keep your pay close to you when Kramer's around, or you'll find your pockets a bit lighter. He's a greedy, sticky-fingered, lying son of a bitch. Oh, that hurts, Lewis, Kramer said with a frown. Aren't we tight, like a little family? Don't families share? He gave a crooked smile. I could share one of my blades with your kidneys, asshole. Kramer kicked up a cloud of dirt, and in the moment, Lewis blinked, he spit a heavy ball of mucus at him. The projectile flew through the sky, missing entirely and leaving a gob of snot on Walker's polished black boots where he leaned lightly against Rayleigh's tent. That wasn't nice, Kramer. Why would you spit on your squad members? Never mind. I don't really care. Your real error was allowing your filthy spit to land on my boot. His anger boiling over, he stepped forward, loosening his hands. What you did is punishable by death. Walker balled his right hand into a fist. A chill ran through Kramer's body. We were only joking around, Walker. You don't have to be so serious all the time. Behind the irritation, Walker's red eyes hid a more corrosive and sinister power. Even Kramer stood back when he dealt with people who disappointed him, or made him mad. Walker's temper and lack of patience caused a lot of friction among the army's leadership. They also caused a lot of fear throughout the prominent Firenze family. Louis, you shouldn't egg Kramer on. You know how emotional and irrational he gets. Walker reached behind him. Drawing a dagger, he tossed it at Kramer's feet, causing the slithery man to fumble backward. The wind picked up again, carrying the raw stench of blood, and decay began to circle the camp. Walker turned towards Rayleigh, calming himself and recollecting his manners. I am Walker, a prince of the Firenze clan. Walker was slightly taller than Rayleigh, at 6 feet 7 inches, and had long white hair and red pupils. Okay, that's all 7. Kid, you introduce yourself now, Tyreen ordered. I'm Rayleigh. I recently arrived from what used to be a prominent civilization across the sea to the west. I was found there by the old man, Theodoric Firenze. He gave me a letter and sent me here. Then an old Firenze general sent me south to the Firenze Military Training Academy. After graduating, I was sent to the north, where I am now. Tyreen looked like a deer in headlights. Old man? Don't talk that way out loud again. You're among infantry now, but it would be bad for all of us if a noble were to hear you speak this way about royalty. You might not be used to titles out in the boonies where you come from, but around here the higher-ups like them, and they won't stand for any apparent disrespect. Do you hear me? Boy, answer me when I goddamn speak to you. Walker pushed closer to Rayleigh. My grandfather found you? Where is he now? What game is he playing? He grabbed Rayleigh by the collar of his ragged shirt. I don't know, Rayleigh replied. He tried to push the prince back. They woke me from a frozen slumber. All I remember is going in for surgery. He knocked Walker's hands free of his shirt, tearing it some more. The world I remember was different. I was different. I was one of just a few survivors at the installation I was stationed at. Just 6, apparently. The others woke up around the same time, and after a while, they set off in different directions. Tyreen's eyebrows perked up. You're a forebear? You are, aren't you? You're one of our predecessors? I have no idea. I was injured in a war and sent home for medical treatment. I enrolled in an experimental program to regrow my missing arm. They took me to a giant tank full of liquid and told me to relax. Next thing I knew, I was being thawed out and shipped here like a piece of beef. How old are you? Tyreen asked. I was born in the late 20th century. I have no idea what year it is by that calendar. But I guess I am an antique now. Tyreen rubbed his temples. It doesn't matter now. Your papers assigned you to us, so now we're your family. If we survive this battle, I'd like to hear more about your memories. Rayleigh took an uncomfortable breath. I'm okay with that. I hear quick footsteps. From over the hill, a small division of soldiers approached in plain clothes, dirt smeared. Message from headquarters, their leader said. Grab your gear. You're to move out and report to the staging area. Metal rang against metal through the camp as soldiers made ready for battle. The calm night was replaced by nervousness and uncertainty. The officers felt the tension and unease, and as they made their rounds, they did what they could to keep their soldiers calm and relaxed. Chapter 5. A battle is unpredictable. The camp awoke to the banging of iron on steel and the sizzle of water. The booming voices of blacksmiths finishing weapons and armor carried orders to their apprentices. Sitting somberly and preparing himself, Rayleigh stared deeply into his sword. With a soft sheepskin rag, he gently wiped the blade clean from tip down to hilt. He held the edge up with one hand, checking it for spots as Tyreen barked order across the small collection of tents. Then the flaps to the makeshift barracks pushed open, and he called in for Rayleigh. Did you read our orders? Oh, getting your equipment ready? Rayleigh handed over the parchment he'd found attached to his tent. I saw that we are to be the vanguard for tonight's assault. Tyreen checked the soldiers' equipment. You're nervous, kid. Don't worry too much. You'll do fine. Smiling affectionately at the blade, Rayleigh set it down next to his bunk and stood. Surprisingly, the assault isn't what's bothering me. It's these endless nights. The daylight's nothing but a tease. Tyreen looked to the sky and then the horizon. I can see how it would be a bit unsettling if you're not used to it. He let out a sigh. Get your stuff together. We're meeting up at my tent. Rayleigh took a deep breath and released it. A calming chill blanketing his goosebump-covered torso. He started organizing his things and checking his rations. The sleeping raven's chest deflated as it awoke, and stretching its wings, it took off out of the tent. Tyreen, walking away from Rayleigh's tent, listened to his men's chatter. A wireless clock on a wood stump, he thought to himself. Landing on the clock, a carrion bird laughed at him. Is this an omen? He wondered. Damn, it's only 6 in the morning. He gathered himself and continued through the shadows to his own tent. The sun brightened in the hazel sky for a moment, its light tainted by the irradiated clouds. The well-fed fire continued to dance, spreading joy across Paul Vale. In the town center, Hirian sat drinking the famous Paul Vale ale from a broken barrel, watching as a freshly boiled skull was prepared from one of the villagers. Terrified and stricken, the remaining city folk stood before the giant king. These were the ones who had been trapped by their own fear and hidden, squandering their opportunity to flee. The majority of the fighting men had already been boiled alive and eaten. The rest had begun to break down. Leading the group was the city's mayor, who was working hard not to let his own anxiety stoke that of his already terrified group. But he could do little to hide the fear carved into his face. Trying to stay calm, the civil leader rubbed his wet palms against his mud-caked, blood-stained clothes. One of the Lestrygonian scouts entered the town square, garbed in wolf and bear furs, and nimbly worked his way toward his celebrating king. Wearily, the scout made his report, looking the king straight in the eye. We have guests, my king. An army extensive enough to match ours has reached the southern plains just outside the town. The king crushed the barrel of ale he held in his hands, sending a flood of beer and wood fragments raining down on the pavement. Rising from his makeshift throne of corpses, he bellowed an enthusiastic order that echoed down the empty streets in every direction from the square. Make ready for battle! Turning to the scout, he asked. How are they here? Have our plans been leaked? As the smaller giant provided more details, his army gathered, and Hirian yelled again. Prepare for war! The army roared back, shaking the walls of the city. You, giant kin, I have a task for you. A Lestrygonian scout barely over 7 feet came to the king's call. Deliver my words to the spear sisters coming from the northern mountains. Tell Ravina that the plan changed, and we are preparing for a siege. They will aid us in defending our spoils. Now go, boy. Make haste. The young giant took off snappily, heading north out of the town. The cold wind turned his hot breath to steam, giving Hirian the appearance of a fire-breather. The sight broke the minds of the villagers, and they panicked. The giants began herding their new slaves back into the building they used as a prison. It reeked of vomit and feces. The Lestrygonians terrorized the prisoners on the way, describing the sweet taste of human flesh and tears. Rob Stein worked to show strength, and doing whatever he could to calm his people. Stay down and out of sight. If a chance comes, we can escape, but we need our wits about us. Finding a clean place to sit at the back, the group of 50 or so, mostly women, began setting up overturned tables to shield themselves. Then they sat without a sound, waiting to see what fate had in store for them. Hirian's vigor, meanwhile, empowered his giant army. His affinity for earth manipulation hardened their skin like iron, and the giant army rallied with their king's power, setting fire to buildings as they gathered in formation and prepared to attack anything that came through the gates of Paul Vale. The sun began to settle, and the brisk night welcomed all to Paul Vale. Fully armored in heavy leather and unpolished iron, Tyreen addressed his 400 soldiers. Tonight we may live, tonight we may die, but tomorrow is never promised. We have been asked to lead the charge against the Lestrygonian army holding this city hostage. We will engage our enemy and keep them occupied until Clan Kira's reinforcements and our own arrive. Show no mercy and you will prevail. With a crash of weapons on shields, the band set forth into the deep fog. Rayleigh advanced with the second wave of the company, gripping his hilt and preparing mentally for what needed to be done. The 6 who had been introduced to him earlier led the way into the valley. With each step, the soft ground gripped their boots and muddied fingers. At a small gesture from Tyreen, the band stopped. They moved like a well-oiled machine, each part ready to pick up and start again. Lilith stepped forward, pushing hair from her face, and began weaving her fingers like a maestro. Lightning crackled and ran across the sky. With a light wave of her hand, she manipulated the wind, drawing up the mischievous flames around the town and shaping them into a hurricane of fire. It grew and fed on itself until it was hot enough to engulf the city. Then, shifting her weight, she sent the firestorm out into every corner of the small town. Lightning struck the barrier of fire and wind, probing it as if looking for a way to penetrate, and hit the ground near the construct. Then the wild electric storm merged with Lilith's magic, solidifying the wall with electricity, trapping the city in an elemental bubble. Stepping back behind the first line of soldiers, Lilith leaned up against a tree, panting. She focused her breathing, trying to regain stamina and mental fortitude. Setting up the barrier had taken more effort than she expected. The dark, heavy, and volatile energy in the area was unfamiliar to her, and it was all she could do to change it into something usable. She felt an intense wave of lightheadedness, and staggered back to find a place where she could rest and regain her composure. Tyrene's instincts were sharpened with concentration. When Lilith finished her task, he scrutinized the southern gate of Paul Vale, unblinking, and then issued the order to attack and kill all combatants separated outside the city, keeping them from the primary invading force. Snarling, drooling, and frenzied, the isolated Lestrygonians gritted their teeth as they sniffed the putrid air of the attacking army. Then, lowering their stances, the savage monstrosities charged their giant bodies into the mass of soldiers, crushing everything in their path. The giants used their overwhelming strength and momentum to drive Tyrene's men back, smashing the soldiers' armor with giant bone axes and clubs and sending them flying across the battlefield. Bodies crashed into the charging band of the wolf, killing the men from the force of the blows. Lestrygonians' barbarians tore through flesh, showering their foes in blood. Weighted steps drove the fallen soldiers into the ground, breaking and bursting their bodies and sending bone shards exploding outward like shrapnel, piercing more armor and sending combatants down from ruptured wounds. Wave after wave, the band of the wolf charged in with a single mind, to take down the mightiest warriors in front of them at all costs. But fear and anguish spread through the soldiers as their friends perished like nothing. With his height, Rayleigh watched as soldiers were flung about and pulverized. He focused on what was around him. Then he heard the command of a raven. "Down!" and responded instinctively. Bodies flew by, just missing him and crashing somewhere behind. The force of their impacts shattered bones and left only impact craters filled with gelatinous puddles. The sight of giant holes with soldiers mashed into them caused even more fear and panic. Rayleigh realized that the next wave of soldiers being sent in included him. He looked to the horizon before him. Rayleigh was a veteran to battlefields, but he stepped forward with a cold sweat. The order to charge was given, and the soldiers burst forward with a frenzied zeal. Taking control of his fear, Rayleigh made his way further forward as bodies were thrown about him, fracturing where they hit the ground, erupting across the front line and piercing armor and flesh, killing soldiers several at a time. Lilith lay against a scarred oak tree, still not recovered from weaving. The elemental energies maintained the barrier around Paul Vale, though. As Rayleigh stepped into a wave of troops, she followed his movement, weaving in and out of combat, just avoiding exploding bodies and blows from giant axes. Then she lost sight of him in a fog of blood. She watched with helpless anticipation as more soldiers vanished into the mist, or fell to their knees, paralyzed with fear, as their weapons failed to pierce giant flesh. Still not having reached any targets, and already drenched in blood, Rayleigh pushed on as man after man fell around him. He dodged flying human bodies, zigzagging through narrow openings between ragdoll corpses and charging giants. Screams echoed in his ears. With a quick step to the right, he placed hand to hilt, and drew his blade cleanly from its sheath to meet a Lestrygonian battle axe made of melded human bones and steel. His sword shattered on contact, and the shards exploded toward him, leaving shallow cuts on his face. Still stunned from the blow, Rayleigh watched the oversized axe come whistling down. The weapon twisted in midair, just missing, as the raven drove its beak into the giant's eye, throwing its balance off. Blood covered the giant's face as Rayleigh's new friend kicked off it and back into the sky. Switching direction, the giant swung back sideways at Rayleigh's body, sending the man flying across the battlefield. Losing all breath, he crashed into the field. Gasping for air, Rayleigh stood and tried to get his bearings. All he saw were body parts of fellow soldiers littered around him. Moans of pain and grief spread across the field. Scrambling wearily over the corpses, Rayleigh scanned for another weapon as he made his way back toward the fight. Ahead, a blood-covered claymore stood erect over a pile of bodies, pinning them to the ground. The huge blade was made to terrify. A long crack ran down the iron blade to a bone hilt that was broken in half. Rayleigh felt a surge of cold energy run through him. With a burst of power, he made an air dash and reached for the broken hilt. Tearing a length of cloth from a body, he wrapped the broken grip so he could hold the blade without cutting his hands. Then he shifted his weight back, pulling the sword out of the corpses and landing on his feet. He headed forward, back into the chaos of the battle. The southern group of the Band of a Wolf was all but annihilated. Less than 50 soldiers were standing, and only a few were still willing to fight. As they began retreating, Rayleigh made his way forward, his body acting on its own, cutting down Lestrygonian after Lestrygonian with the great sword. Sensing an attack, he pulled the sword up, using it as a shield to block a great axe blow. The force of the impact broke his ribs. Coughing and spitting blood, Rayleigh gritted his teeth again. He leaned forward, gripping the ground with his toes. Pushing off at a steep angle, he pierced the giant's leg and twisted the blade, cutting deep into the flesh and reaching bone. The Lestrygonian toppled forward, and Rayleigh, down on one knee, summoned all his strength and exploded upward, cutting the Lestrygonian in half. "The southern battalion is all but lost, sir." Tyreen turned to the messenger. "There are only 50 survivors of the 200 you sent." He felt sick to his stomach. What the hell is Kramer doing? The stench of his men's bodies caused his stomach to turn, and he gritted his teeth. "Send word to Walker at the west gate, and to Berlin and Yoshi at the east. I want them to do whatever is needed to deal with the threat. And send a message to Kramer. Have him collect Lilith and head for the southern gates. They're to create a diversion, collect any survivors, and return here." The young man, looking like a startled deer, wrote everything down word for word. As soon as Tyreen finished, he sprinted off to the scribes, who hastily copied the orders out on new parchment and sent scouts off into the haze. Leaning against the claymore, Rayleigh tried to control his breathing. Fog blanketed the battlefield. He'd fought his way through the gates and, looking around, he saw now that he was deep inside the city, almost to the southern bridge. Raging heat and lightning spewing out of the elemental barrier created a heat wall that did little to hide the giant shadows behind it. Lestrygonians were gathering to the east and west of him. Pulling the sword out of the ground, he rested the blade on his shoulder and gazed through the thick mist, silently allowing it to devour him. The red smoke provided just enough cover to conceal him. As he regained some stamina, Rayleigh lowered the sword and watched the giant shadows lurking through the fog. Bending his knees, he took a basic sword stance he'd learned in the academy and leaned forward, shifting his weight onto his left leg. He jetted out of the mist, catching the giants by surprise. He needed one swing per giant, slicing 2 of the creatures in half. Leaving the others confused and in disarray, he faded back into the fog again, looking for the next colossal shadow to cut down. Lieutenant Rama, leading the rest of his forces steadily up from the south, reached the fields where the band of wolves had been deployed. Mangled corpses littered the ground, and rivers of blood had saturated the earth till it wouldn't soak up anymore. Craters pocked the whole span of the battlefield. Looking north, Rama saw the barrier of fire and lightning still caging the city. With a gesture, he deployed his army to reinforce what was left of the vanguard. Cold sweat dripped from his brow at the sight of his soldiers' torn-up bodies. He swallowed his saliva and pushed his men forward. Heavy horses and armored cavalry trampled the corpses still further, driving them deep into the soft ground. At another gesture, the infantry on the right flank turned east, and the cavalry on the left headed west. Rama moved forward without breaking his horse's stride, leading the rest of his force north into the thickening haze. Blinded by the fog, Rayleigh stood still, closing his eyes, doing what he could to give his strained vision some relief. The mechanical organisms in his body made his limbs tingle numbly. He'd found he could sense the microorganisms in every muscle twitch. Working at full capacity sent a massive amount of information to his brain, heightening his senses, and he quickly became attuned to the nanomachines living within him. They were running at 100%. With every breath, his body consumed more energy. Rayleigh opened his eyes. He could see clearly through the fog now, and his other senses had intensified. Needing a focus, he cut his hand. The pain cleared his mind. He gripped the sword again, blood dripping from his hand and down the bone handle, mixing with the sweat and blood already there. He moved to the west, looking for an advantage on the group of giants ahead of him. Exhausted, the Lestrygonians huddled around their leader, receiving orders. Dripping with sweat and blood, they peered into the dense blanketing fog, probing the clouds with their weapons and searching for a way through the barrier that stood between them and their brethren. Lunging out of the mist, Rayleigh leaped into the sky and came down on two unsuspecting Lestrygonians, cutting both in half with a one-armed swing of the giant's sword. Surging with power and speed, Rayleigh wielded the massive blade like a short sword, slashing in every direction with little technique and dancing around his slower attackers. Time had slowed around him. His mind fogged, as if in a dream, and his body drew on its connection to the veil, attuning itself to the dark realm and drawing in large amounts of energy. The swell of power guided Rayleigh, overwhelming his senses and boosting his combat abilities. He began to see glimpses of the future, predicting his enemy's next moves, reading each remaining Lestrygonian in turn and cutting them down with ease. Adrenaline took over as he landed, and he felt himself giving in to his bloodlust. He moved his head slowly, searching for new targets. Remembering the group to the east, he set off with incredible speed, reaching them quickly and taking out two barbarously. Dodging an attack, Rayleigh drove his sword upward, slicing through one of the giants, before falling back to the ground. Exhilarated, he let himself to sink deeper into his gluttonous, adrenaline-driven frenzy, gradually losing his self-awareness. Kramer watched the battle leaning from the branch of a giant redwood, leaning on the trunk while juggling dice in one hand and twirling a dagger in the other. Below, a messenger appeared and began climbing. He stopped when he reached Kramer and handed him a parchment. Reading it, Kramer smiled. "Finally! A date with Lilith! Just when I was getting bored." His twisted smile sent a chill down the messenger's spine. Noticing that the young man was still looking at him, Kramer snarled, setting him off balance, before jumping from the branch with glee and skipped out of the forest and onto the battlefield, throwing daggers in random directions, not caring who was hit. Taken aback, the messenger dropped down from the tree and turned around to go and find Lieutenant Rama. He found Kramer standing before him, staring at the young man with cold, condescending eyes. He cut the messenger's throat with a quick slash, and a smile radiated across his face. He laughed and danced in joy, licking the man's blood from the dagger, and his eyes lit up crimson, even as the messenger's severed head hit the ground, the face frozen in surprise. Picking up the head and twirling it by the hair, Kramer skipped out of the forest once more, while darkness consumed the body behind him. He crossed the battlefield carelessly, changing his path to avoid confrontations and sneaking in behind the scattered Forenza army. A supply officer on break, seeing the lanky man skipping and whistling while twirling the human head about, bent over and puked. When he looked up, Kramer caught his eye and raised an index finger to his lips. The man scrambled away toward his commanding officer. Kramer, not breaking stride, continued on toward where he'd last seen Lilith. The stress of the battle allowed him to slip through with little notice. Excited as he was about seeing Lilith, Kramer enjoyed watching the one-sided massacre of the troops he was supposed to be leading. The army was being torn to shreds by giant marauders with battle axes. Blood exploded around him, stunning the soldiers, and leaderless, the men panicked and fell to the giants. Screams echoed about, hitting Kramer's deaf ears. He was focused on reaching Lilith. Then cries of giants rang out, causing Kramer to stop and take notice. Through the mist of blood, he could just make out the silhouette of a soldier fighting for his life. Kramer moved on indifferently until he finally caught the scent of lavender. "Lilith!" he sang out. "My Lilith! Where is my lily?" A colossal tree spread its arms wide, the shadows of its leaves giving some protection to Lilith, who lay tucked away against the trunk.